This story follows a Korean guy named Kang Woo-jin. He used to be just another Seoul high school kid, chasing success and dreaming of making his family proud. That carefree life ended without warning, with no chance to rewind or fix anything. An unknown force suddenly tore open a portal and dragged the student into a completely different world. There, he faced endless waves of nightmarish monsters, hungry to rip him apart piece by piece. School and family vanished in an instant, replaced by a world where only the fastest killer gets to survive. From that moment on, he gained the Necromancer class, along with skills that allowed him to summon the dead. Over the next brutal 20 years, Kang Woo-jin evolved non-stop, crushing new monsters day after day. His abilities climbed past all limits, and slaughtering beasts slowly became routine. Then that same unknown force threw him back to Earth, as if mocking everything he had endured. On his home planet, only 5 years had passed, yet that was more than enough to change everything. Seoul in 2021 was no longer a calm or comfortable place to live. Even school had turned into a place where no one could truly relax or feel safe. A top student named Jamon usually rushed straight home once classes ended. Local bullies blocked his path and made it clear that his easy days were over. His perfect answers in class had long made other students feel small and inferior. The bullies decided it was time to put the overconfident honor student in his place and leave bruises on his neat face. Now he would finally learn that standing out was a mistake and blending in was safer. As the honor student's blood dripped onto the ground, his attackers openly laughed at him. No one here was shocked by blood anymore. Scenes like this had become normal in this world. Then the sky warped, and a strange flickering aura spread through the area. An overwhelming force opened a portal and returned a former student of this school from another world. At first, no one understood what was happening, and the bullies even stopped mid-beating. Moments later, a man appeared, someone who had survived hell for 20 long years. To Kang, the scene looked savage and wrong, and he decided it was time to step in. The bullies responded by telling the old guy to take his meds and stay out of business that wasn't his. Kang had long forgotten what disrespect felt like and made it clear that he was the one setting the rules now. His calm confidence invited an attack, as if the outcome had already been decided. A slight tilt of his head was enough to dodge the blow without effort. After that, the high-level necromancer chose to show these worms who the real boss was. He snapped his fingers like Thanos, expecting a Marvel-style finale. But reality wasn't running a blockbuster. A second passed, nothing happened, and the moment looked like a failed joke. It became clear that after returning to Earth, his powers were gone. He still had the necromancer class, but every single skill had been completely reset. Even so, Kang retained his combat experience and mastery of martial arts. Using that alone, he effortlessly knocked out the leader of the bullies and proved he was still someone to fear. Only then did everyone around finally realize this guy wasn't as simple as he looked. It was already too late to react because Kang caught that familiar scent of blood. Seconds later, the bullies were sprawled on the ground, unable to get back up. The honor student had never seen martial arts that clean and confident. He stared at Kang like a comic book hero who had shown up to save him. The lesson in discipline was over, and the necromancer decided to ask a few questions. He had spent 2 decades in another world, while only 5 years had passed on Earth. That meant not everything was lost, and maybe his family was still alive. After that realization, Kang decided to say goodbye and use a teleport to go home. Apparently, he still wasn't used to the fact that all his skills were completely gone. The finger snap failed, like stepping into a fight as Conor McGregor, only to realize there were no gloves, no gear, nothing. It looked like he would need to get to know Jamon a bit better and ask for his help. It wouldn't hurt if the kid could spare some cash for food and a subway ride. The honor student didn't want to give away his last money, but his life had just been saved and debts had to be paid. Right after returning to his home planet, Kang decided to take a slow walk and see what the world had turned into. For the first time in forever, he caught his own reflection and felt a brief chill run down his spine. The ordinary teenager he once was had changed beyond recognition, even though it felt like just yesterday he was a kid with a future ahead of him. As he looked around, Kang noticed an unusual number of people wearing military uniforms. Curiosity kicked in hard as he tried to figure out what was going on and why the subway entrance was now sealed off. Girls passing by exchanged glances and suddenly burst out laughing. From the outside, Kang looked like someone who had escaped a deserted island and forgotten what humans even looked like. He chose not to dwell on it and decided to figure things out on his own. Ever since childhood, Kang had been curious by nature and never afraid to explore the unknown. The moment he stepped into the subway, a system instantly issued a danger warning. That was when he realized he had entered a dungeon where one wrong move could cost his life. To get back out, he needed to obtain some unknown return stone. Kang had no idea what that item was, but the sense of looming danger kept growing stronger. Slow, confident footsteps echoed from a dark corridor ahead. Soon, a massive red dog emerged, having come here to feast on fresh meat. It attacked without hesitation and nearly bit his head clean off. The necromancer barely dodged in time and instinctively tried to activate blood domination. Of course it failed. On Earth, everything had to be rebuilt from zero. For now, he could rely only on basic martial arts and years of hard-earned experience. These monsters were called Drebbits, better known as devil dogs. There was nothing supernatural about them, and even an iron rod was enough to take one down. The taste of blood hit his senses, and his body came alive, like slipping back into an unrestricted Dragon Ball mode. After that, the number of monsters around him multiplied by the dozens. They began to surround him, not realizing that he was enjoying every second of it. A few clean, confident moves sent another wave of red dogs straight to hell. An unknown system announced that his hunter level had risen instantly. Everything clicked into place. Kill monsters, grow stronger, and reclaim lost progress step by step. There was nothing wrong with gaining power, especially if it meant cleansing his hometown. The experience points earned in the past were still there waiting to be spent. Without hesitation, Kang poured every single point into boosting his basic stats. He felt his body harden and grow stronger, fully aware that this was only the beginning. To find the return stone, the entire dungeon had to be cleared. The necromancer welcomed the challenge and spent the next several hours non-stop wiping out monsters. Even that wasn't enough to return to the surface. It turned out that each section of the subway had its own monster group that needed to be eliminated. His stats kept rising, slowly restoring fragments of his former power. At last, Kang felt it. He could summon the dead once again. This was the very skill that had once made him a legend in the other world. A single spell was enough to pull dead souls out of hell and call them to his side. They obeyed every command, and once the skeletons were unleashed, they handled all the dirty work. When Kang and his army finished off every monster, the subway was practically drowned in blood. At that moment, a glowing red stone appeared in the dark corridor, calling out to him. Meanwhile, a local security guard showed up near the subway station. He had gone for lunch, calmly, convinced that only a lunatic would enter such a dangerous place. Returning to the station, the guard saw the broken lock and screamed in pure terror. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone and immediately called for backup. His pupils dilated as cold sweat ran down his forehead. From the open portal stepped a strange man who showed zero reaction to the danger around him. It felt like he had just finished a casual stroll, not walked out of a deadly dungeon. By that point, Kang had already realized that dungeon gemstones were now the hottest and most valuable currency around. One member of a powerful guild had just scored a reward that was truly worth killing for. He had no intention of sharing it with the captain and was already imagining the cash hidden safely under his mattress. The plan felt flawless until a familiar voice cut through the cold alley behind him. The sharp sound of heels made his body lock up as his entire life flashed through his mind in seconds. When red eyes ignited in the darkness, all doubt vanished. She was standing right there. Almost every hunter in the city knew exactly who Yunhee of the Huarang Guild was, one of the strongest hunters in the country, a woman who earned the title of captain through pure dominance. There was nowhere to run, and giving up a year's salary was not an option he was willing to accept. He chose to challenge her and go all in, betting everything on one desperate move. First, he tried to stall for time, throwing out cheap tricks to distract Yunhee, but her speed existed on an entirely different tier. She had time to smile before mercilessly cutting him apart. That was the fate of anyone who stole guild profits and thought they were smarter than the rest. The moment Yunhee recovered all the stolen crystals, an urgent message hit her phone. An unidentified intruder had been spotted near one of the city's portals and needed to be dealt with. Kang had no idea that his return had already drawn the attention of Seoul's real apex predators. He decided to take a bus back to his old neighborhood and postpone monster hunting until tomorrow. There would be time later to figure out what happened to the planet and where the monsters came from. Right now, all he wanted was to see his family and erase the hollow years of separation. Unfortunately, that plan was never meant to happen. When Kang reached his old home, he realized nothing from the past remained. The small, cozy house was gone, replaced by a towering office building. It was already too late to look for his parents, and hunger was hitting hard. With no better ideas, he stepped into a local diner to remember the taste of his favorite noodles. It felt like heaven on earth, even if it cost him his last bit of cash. At that moment, another hungry young guy approached the diner. As soon as he walked in and noticed Kong, he hesitated and clearly grew nervous. It was Jamon, the same honor student who had nearly been beaten to death by bullies. For the main character, this reunion felt like fate handing him a clean solution to future problems. In this changed world, money and a roof over one's head meant everything. If the necromancer didn't want to sleep on the streets, he would have to ask for help. Jamon lived alone, so all that remained was convincing him to do a friendly favor. Kang asked to stay the night, offering all the money he had in return. In truth, he was simply giving back the same bills he had taken from the student that morning. Awkwardness had never been Kang's weakness, and that was probably why he usually got what he wanted. After a calm night, Kang decided to visit his old school the next morning. He met his favorite teacher, who struggled to believe this wasn't a dream. You don't see a student who vanished for 20 years return alive and untouched every day. They shared a couple of cups of coffee and talked quietly, digging through memories of the past. Near the end of the conversation, Kang asked for a list of students. He wanted to repay the friend who had kept him from freezing on Seoul's cold streets. Kang understood perfectly that Jamon would run into trouble with the same bullies again. Bad guys almost always come back for payback after being humiliated. To keep the defenseless honor student out of danger, interference was unavoidable. The bullies quickly surrounded the kid, making sure no witnesses were around. They were just about to smash his face when a familiar presence cut in. The necromancer appeared, clearly ready to show his power again. He challenged every one of them to step outside and settle things the hard way. Rumors of what was happening spread across the school in no time. Students ditched their classes and gathered on the rooftop to see how it would all end. All that was missing was popcorn and cola. The scene felt like a UFC tournament final with the entire school as the audience. Kang suddenly realized he had seen moments like this countless times before, just in a different world. Almost every world breeds people blinded by arrogance, drunk on power and authority. During his time on Alphen, Kang had crossed paths with that kind more than once. His greatest rival there was the necromancer Casillas, a man who summoned only the souls of sinners to seize control. Compared to battles like that, today's school clash felt laughably insignificant. The lead bully finally snapped and called in his friends, deciding to overwhelm the old man with numbers. As the wise say, kindness is met with kindness, but evil is answered with justice. Kang made it painfully clear that school kids weren't even close to his level. A few sharp, precise punches to the face instantly sobered up the overconfident idiots. They were forced to endure humiliation in front of the entire school, while the necromancer didn't even break a sweat. Kang turned around and walked away, as if nothing special had happened. At that moment, a taxi screeched to a stop near the school, and a pale, terrified woman jumped out. It was his mother. One look from her was enough to turn the necromancer back into a scared child. Seconds later, they were holding each other, tears pouring freely. Kang buried his face into his mother's shoulder and forgot how to breathe for a moment. According to her, right after her eldest son vanished, portals filled with monsters opened all over the world. Subway stations instantly became dungeons, and his father died on the way to work. His mother was left alone to raise a young daughter named Sua, and the family's finances collapsed fast. Every day turned into torture, with survival meaning a fight over every last coin. Stepping into their new home, Kang immediately felt how heavy the burden had been on his mother's shoulders. His heart tightened at the sight of the cramped room where you could barely turn around. In one of the boxes by the wall, he found his and his father's belongings that his mother had never thrown away. A little later, young Sua returned from kindergarten, barely recognizing her older brother. He once changed her diapers, and now she called him Uncle Kang. That's what happens when you're gone for 5 years, but it wasn't the end. There was still time to fix things. As night fell, it was time to rest and think about tomorrow. The main character replayed his entire journey, trying to figure out his next move. 20 years ago, Alphen had summoned him without reason or warning. That world felt like a brutal game where life was always on the line. Survival demanded fiercer combat than anything he had ever known. After countless bloody battles, he finally reached the peak as a max-level necromancer. Then came the encounter with the spatial administrator who sent him back to Earth. For years, Kang had dreamed of reuniting with his family, thinking it would be simple. But after returning, he realized his beloved planet had changed beyond recognition. His father was dead, his family was barely surviving, and it tore his heart apart. This couldn't continue. He had to use his abilities and start making real money. His family had lived too long without support, and now it was time to fix everything. The next morning, Kang bought a new phone and remembered the dungeon incident. Back then, the guard had told him about the Awaken profession and its key details. People with supernatural abilities were called the Awakened. This profession offered a way to earn serious cash and escape poverty. Kang made up his mind that he wouldn't return home until he could support his family. He texted his mom, saying he would stay with a friend and make her happy very soon. Then he dialed Jamon's number and heard a completely unfamiliar voice on the other end. Turns out it was a fake number. Trust level about as solid as an NFT bought at 3 a.m. because of hype. A serious punishment was coming his way, and compared to that, dealing with bullies would feel like paradise. After a long school day, the young and promising honor student was heading home. He thought about the guy who had saved his life, yet still considered him a total psycho. That was exactly why he gave a fake number, deciding he never wanted to cross paths with that madman again. When Jamon got home, it took him a moment to process what had even happened there. It turned out Kang had already been in his room for a while, acting like the place was his own. He clearly didn't care that breaking into someone else's apartment could easily land him in prison. Completely relaxed, he explained that he was an Awaken and planned to start a career as a hunter. That claim didn't sound crazy, considering he had beaten up 5 bullies alone without even breaking a sweat. Jamon added that awakened hunters make insane money and can afford almost anything. The first step was registering with the association and getting official access to dungeons. To feel safer, joining a guild and securing backup was also an option. Almost no one worked solo anymore. It was considered way too risky. Even so, the necromancer trusted no one and wanted to operate strictly on his own terms. He needed to book an appointment with the association, and Jamon agreed to help. He grabbed the phone and realized it was an iPhone from the era when Elon Musk hadn't even thought about Mars yet. The world seemed to darken around him, and the necromancer's expression changed completely. It turned out he had bought the phone early that morning from a store that swore it was the latest model. The seller was just a scammer, but it was far too late for revenge. Before registering a dungeon for clearing, a license was required. It also became clear that entering a dungeon came with an entry fee. Kang had no choice but to ask the honor student for help again. He asked to borrow money and honestly warned that he'd be staying in the apartment for a while. Jamon froze, unsure whether to get mad, panic, or just accept it, while Kang couldn't care less. The next morning, the main character headed to the Awakened Association and instantly drew everyone's attention. By demonstrating his ability to summon the dead, he made it clear he wasn't leaving without a license. A simple rabbit carcass was enough for the demonstration. After a few lines in an unknown language, the corpse rose and turned into a skeleton. Everyone screamed like they'd stumbled into a horror live stream with no donate button and no exit. He kept his real tricks in reserve for more serious missions. It turned out necromancers were extremely rare among the Awakened. To judge the level of such a hunter, the strength of their familiars had to be tested. A green goblin was brought into the arena, and the fight was authorized to begin. Kang immediately ordered the skeleton forward, showing no mercy. After several hours, one of the association staff officially handed him a hunter license. The skeleton turned out to be fairly weak, earning the necromancer the lowest rank. His talents clearly hadn't fully recovered yet, but it was enough to start a career. Now he could legally enter dungeons and earn a living. His arrival immediately caught the attention of a more experienced Awakened team. They suggested teaming up to make the dungeon clear safer. The necromancer refused at first, unwilling to share the profits. He had completely forgotten about the dungeon entry fee. Many rookies teamed up specifically to split that cost. A mid-rank miner with experience named Dosu offered a practical solution. If Kang entered with their team, he would only have to pay a small part of the fee. After a short pause, Kang agreed. He had no real choice, and his money was running out. While preparing for the raid, he met an insecure newcomer. This cheerful yet slightly nervous guy was named Sangu, and it was only his third raid. He had awakened a few months earlier and immediately dropped out of school to chase an adventurer's life. The kid dreamed of a legendary future, but was clearly terrified of messing up. The moment he saw injured hunters, those dreams evaporated fast. It was obvious the dungeon clear wouldn't be easy, but no one planned to back out. The team leader was overly confident and rallied everyone around their shared goal. A stench hit them hard, like they'd walked into a raid that felt more like an after-school Call of Duty lobby. That was apparently the stench of goblins who had been squatting on this subway station for way too long. The fight kicked off without warning, and even the terrified Sangu decided it was time to prove himself. His fireball technique actually worked, despite him being nothing more than a rookie. The rest of the squad didn't shy away from the dirty and dangerous work either. Their attacks tore into the monsters, dealing serious and painful damage. Even with a numbers advantage, the goblins barely stood a chance. To avoid standing out, the necromancer summoned only a single undead, yet that alone was more than enough. The skeleton turned out to be surprisingly strong and quickly earned plenty of impressed looks. To power it up, a significant amount of experience points had to be burned on boosting its stats. This was the perfect moment to understand why hunters were often called true adventurers. These people gambled their lives for the sake of blood-red crystals hidden in dungeons. Each stone sold for around $200, though the price paid to obtain them was far higher. Many hunters lost their heads over those crystals, willing to betray anyone for them. It seemed Sangu had already been consumed by greed and a dangerous sense of grandeur. Thoughts of money were exactly what caused many adventurers to fall apart in the end. After clearing the first wave of monsters, teams relaxed and forgot that far deadlier threats waited deeper inside. A massive hobgoblin appeared ahead, also known as the Goblin Alpha. Monsters like this were far smarter and stronger than regular goblins. Every newbie knew that. The captain loudly urged the team to raise their spirits and not even think about retreating. He laid out what he believed was the perfect plan and ordered everyone to play their part. The hunters trusted him and began preparing for the decisive battle. It was as if they didn't realize they were facing an enemy on a completely different level. Kang had encountered creatures like this on Alphen and knew exactly how dangerous they were. The Alpha possessed frightening intelligence and the ability to cast spells. But the true threat wasn't magic. It was the skill of absolute control. The hobgoblin could summon subordinates and force them to obey without question. At first, the goblins hid in dark corners, then began striking from the shadows. There was no need for close combat when a thin needle laced with poison could do the job silently. Once the toxin entered the bloodstream, it was almost instantly over. Survival was nearly impossible, especially without an experienced medic on the team. What had seemed like a casual walk suddenly flipped into a nightmare. The Alpha's leadership and sharp intellect were exactly what made it such a lethal opponent. Only now did the fools finally realize that the Goblin Commander wasn't a basic enemy, but a true night terror. The captain panicked and shouted for an immediate retreat. Hunters who had been confident seconds earlier scattered like frightened children. It was hard to blame them. The enemy was far more prepared and brutal. These monsters had already wiped out more than one adventurer team. Not everyone managed to escape, and losses were unavoidable. The Alpha clearly reveled in the chaos, savoring its own superiority. It unleashed powerful bursts of magic, paralyzing multiple victims at once. The plan worked. The insecure rookie Sangu took a direct hit to the back. In a proper team, allies would have rushed to protect him immediately. But Sangu had joined a group where everyone looked out only for themselves, and he was abandoned fast. The hunters left him behind, and the air around him grew heavy with doom. Goblins closed in from every side, while a single mysterious figure watched from the darkness. Kang didn't run with the others. He had been waiting a long time to start a real goblin hunt. To steady himself, he summoned several powerful skeletons to his side. Seconds later, the undead charged into battle against goblins from another world. As the massacre raged, two captains faced each other, ready to decide right there who was truly stronger. Kang had no intention of backing down. He was used to being the one who struck first. A precise strike pierced straight through the enemy's skull, sealing a clean and unquestionable victory. The system instantly boosted his level, letting Kang feel like a real superhero for a brief moment. He acted purely for himself, never once considering that his actions had also saved a young rookie. Just a few months ago, that kid was an ordinary student, and now he had stood one step away from death. He survived, asked for help, and it was right then that Kang paused to think for the first time. His goal was simple: grow his own power and support his family, while the fate of strangers barely mattered. For the right money, he'd be ready to save Greenland, Taiwan, and Kanye West's career all at once. The necromancer helped the rookie, then immediately sent him off to collect blood crystals. A life saved meant a serious debt, and that was exactly how the adventurer business worked. Watching Kang, the rookie couldn't believe this monster was ranked F. It felt impossible. It was obvious the necromancer was far stronger and deliberately hiding his power to stay off the radar. Together, they pushed deeper into the dungeon, wiping out monsters with steady precision like a single unit. Whenever Sangu needed support, the senior hunter instantly used restoration magic. In that time, they gathered crystals worth several $1,000s, and this was only the beginning. For perhaps the first time in his life, Kang showed greed and made it clear that money mattered to him. If Sangu failed to repay his debt, he would quickly regret not dying back in the goblin fight. After fully clearing the dungeon, it was time to head up when the system suddenly issued a danger alert. The necromancer sensed a faint thirst for blood, even though there were no monsters left ahead. It wasn't hard to guess. The remaining team members had set up an ambush. Kang ordered the filthy rats to come out of hiding and finally face him directly. At first glance, they almost looked ashamed, as if regret had finally caught up to them. In reality, the hunters were just scared and convinced their comrades were already beyond saving. That only raised one question: why come back at all instead of retreating to the barrier? The captain tried to smooth things over, claiming he had come to his senses in time. He insisted he only wanted to help and make sure everything was under control. In truth, his eyes were locked on the return stones, worth a fortune on the market. Kang calmly poured them onto the ground like they were nothing more than cheap candy. Anyone was free to step forward and try to claim the reward. Instead of a bloody clash, the captain smiled and called it all a misunderstanding. He swore they had come purely to help and never cared about the money. His performance was so convincing that even the distrustful necromancer relaxed for a split second. Kang thought he had imagined the conspiracy, believing reality was simpler than that. The moment he let his guard down, those bastards revealed exactly why they had returned. Brutal strikes came crashing in from all sides, aimed at the two rookies at once. Sangu, who had only just healed his wounds, was thrown back into serious danger. There was no doubt left. The captain was rotten to the core and didn't deserve a second chance. He drew his sword and lunged forward, determined to eliminate an unwanted rival. While a bloody hunter-on-hunter massacre erupted underground, it was time to briefly shift focus. An elite squad of adventurers was just wrapping up their mission. Yunhee received an unexpected call and learned that the recent intruder had been located. His name was Kang Woo-jin, and there was almost no information about him. He had only just registered as a hunter and should be clearing his first dungeon right now. Yunhee immediately set out in search of him, unaware that the boy was in mortal danger. The captain was certain the rookie was dead until he saw that devilish smile. The cheap ambush had failed, and the moment of reckoning had arrived. A savage impact against the concrete shattered several ribs and twisted his insides apart. It was merciless, but that exact mindset was how the necromancer survived on Alphen. Back on Earth, he had no intention of changing and remained absolutely ruthless. The rest of the team couldn't even hope for salvation. They had betrayed their profession, and now the dead would drag their souls straight into hell. Even as death closed in, Dosu still clung to hope for a second chance. Far too naive a thought for a world like this. A man who survived 20 years in hell can't be bought with pretty words. A cold dagger pierced the greedy captain's heart and drained his soul down to the last drop. That day claimed not only monsters, but also young hunters who chose to gamble with a deadly game. Watching it all unfold, the young rookie had no doubts left. Standing before him was a vicious, merciless hunter, ready to do anything for profit and levels. Opinions about the main character could differ, but at times, this guy was genuinely terrifying. Over the course of the day, the necromancer saved Sangu's life twice. Help like that never comes free, and the price would be doubled. Half an hour later, the dungeon administrator grew uneasy and considered calling the recon team. He was convinced all hunters were dead until the barrier finally opened. Only 2 members of the large team managed to reach the exit. The administrator sensed something was wrong but chose not to ask unnecessary questions. He knew hunters died in dungeons all the time, and it shocked no one anymore. Even so, Kang had to leave a phone number for questioning after the investigation. Once the mission was complete, they immediately sold the precious blood crystals. The tempting scent of easy money made the necromancer's heart beat faster than usual. In a single raid, he earned over $10,000 and finally escaped poverty. Now big money could be made every day, securing a comfortable life for his family. His partner's mood was far darker, knowing debts for a saved life were waiting ahead. Sangu had been careless and misheard the amount he owed. Instead of $4,000, he believed the debt was $40,000. He would have to seriously rack his brain, maybe even sell his grandmother's apartment. After wrapping up the dungeon business, Kang decided to stop by a phone store. This was where a guy nicknamed Donut loved scamming trusting customers. His real name was Hoon, and today, his sweet life came to an end. He had sold the wrong person an old phone at the price of a brand new model. Kang didn't waste time talking and went straight to beating the fat man down. Donut needed to learn the boomerang rule. Bad deeds always come back around. His face turned into a bowling ball, like stepping into the ring against Prime Mike Tyson. That was enough for him to swear he'd never scam customers again. Besides, fixing the mistake was unavoidable anyway. Kang demanded a brand new phone that had only just hit the market. With that settled, he decided to update his contact list. He could have gone home and eaten properly, but plans derailed once again. Unknown men surrounded him, and the situation clearly promised nothing good. The necromancer tensed up and spotted a woman who was obviously their boss. Yun-hee locked eyes with him, making it clear she intended to teach him a harsh lesson today. Kang reacted with open hostility, warning that any touch would end with her on her knees on the asphalt. He had no idea he was facing one of the leaders of the Huarang Guild and a true superstar of the hunter world. Yun-hee released her aura, making it obvious she hadn't come to chat. She hated it when filthy worms crawled into dungeons belonging to another guild. To make sure it never happened again, she was ready to put the guy in his place fast. Kang tried to toss out another joke, but the next instant he felt a cold palm slam against his face. The captain's guard lunged forward and delivered the first crushing blow. It became instantly clear no one here was playing games. One wrong move could end with a tongue ripped out, and that wasn't a metaphor. The necromancer sprang back to his feet and launched a counterattack. He was known for his wild confidence, but today the balance of power began to shift. One precise move from Yun-hee was enough for the fearless guy to clearly feel a rib crack. First, he slammed hard onto his back, then felt with his own body what that flexible woman was truly capable of. Her kick crashed into his face like a runaway train with no brakes, wiping everything in its path. In that instant, the guy finally understood one simple truth. He was nowhere near the strongest in this world. The message was clear. Messing with someone else's dungeons without permission was a fast track to having your life collapse like a house of cards. Maybe on planet Alphen the necromancer had been a god, but here he was just another rookie with decent talent. If he wanted situations like this to never happen again, he'd have to grind until sweat poured down, squeezing every drop of progress. After returning to his friend's apartment, he carefully explained everything that had happened. It turned out Lady Yun-hee was a world-famous adventurer, and only suicidal idiots tried to stand in her way. The Huarang Guild ranked among the top 3, alongside Hammer and KN. Their influence had long gone beyond raids, spreading deep into the country's politics and economy. Starting a war with them would be pure stupidity, especially while most of the necromancer's power was still sealed. Kang chose to shelve that problem for later and focus entirely on his own growth. He sincerely thanked his friend for providing warmth, shelter, and a safe place to sleep. Kang didn't just buy him a new perfume. He also left a solid stack of cash behind. For a regular student dreaming of university, it felt like a revelation. Now he could finally buy the right books and hire an experienced tutor. Even so, Kang had no rush to leave this cozy nest and planned to stay for weeks, maybe even months. His mom's apartment was far too small, so he needed to save up for a bigger, proper home. The honor student noticed the brand new phone from the ads, like Kang had unlocked a fresh skin while everyone else was still grinding the starter gear. Kang chose not to go into details and didn't want to scare his friend for no reason. By then, insane amounts of money had already hit his balance. It turned out Sangu had sold everything he owned to repay the debt. They immediately agreed to meet at a local cafe and talk things through. The rookie looked lost, barely daring to lift his eyes toward the necromancer. Kang demanded an explanation, trying to understand why he had received 10 times more money than expected. Sangu dropped to his knees, begged for mercy, and even promised to pay more. The fear was so overwhelming that the guy completely forgot what dignity even was. He replayed the dungeon events over and over in his head, terrified the same fate awaited him. Sangu was shaking like he'd already been sentenced, even though Kang hadn't planned anything like that. Since Sangu was willingly handing over the money, Kang decided not to argue. In the end, they agreed to meet again tomorrow and start working together to erase financial problems for good. The next morning, Kang warmed up and headed to the Central Park. Sangu was already there, arriving in his old beat-up car. He had no money left to keep paying debts, so they decided to form a small alliance. From now on, the young rookie would assist and handle all prep work for dungeon raids. At first, he was even happy, thinking this could be called a support role. In reality, he was basically an errand runner, and there wasn't much pride in that. Still, he earned a cut of the profits, which was far more than he'd made with his previous team. After a year of this partnership, Sangu would clear all his debts and finally breathe freely. He was genuinely relieved and promised to do everything possible to not disappoint his partner. The next morning, he was overflowing with energy, strength, and pure enthusiasm. By then, their next raid target had already been chosen. They were heading to the exit near Mabong Station, where local monsters had already killed dozens of hunters. Those roaches had clearly grown way too comfortable there. They hadn't yet faced real adventurers and had no idea what true rock and roll felt like. The necromancer immediately sensed his accumulated points and poured them into boosting his stats. After that, he summoned a solid support force and ordered them to fight until the very end. The skeletons charged forward without hesitation, tearing into the monsters. The assistant was given an easy task, collecting the valuable stones. Kang did everything possible to make sure his helper never had to risk his own life. It was satisfying to watch him work, especially given the insane speed of the clear. Normally, a dungeon like this takes around 2 hours, yet the necromancer wiped the entire place in just 15 minutes. They didn't stop for a second, spending the whole day methodically erasing every monster that spawned. When the assistant headed to the Crystal Exchange Center, a very pleasant surprise was waiting for him. Sangu expected a modest payout, but the final number blew every expectation out of the water. It turned out they had earned over $50,000 in a single day, like Mr. Beast casually dropping a paycheck into their account. If things kept going like this, even as a basic errand runner, Sangu could stack absurd money and end up rich. From that moment on, he was ready to scrub toilets if it meant staying close to Kang Woo-jin. For a regular guy with no connections or wealthy parents, this felt like a chance handed down by the gods themselves. Of course, when two young guys start climbing up from rock bottom, rumors spread fast. One of the country's most influential guilds, Hammer, heard about it the very next day. They employed an experienced and sharp captain in charge of scouting. His name was Chan, and his team's main job was finding new promising hunters. That day, he was informed that two inexperienced rookies had bought entry tickets to a highly dangerous dungeon. Instead of spending a full day inside, they cleared it in just 30 minutes. More than that, they kept repeating the same feat every time monsters respawned from the portal. It was obvious these were special adventurers worth watching closely. Official reports listed their rank as low, but the gap between paperwork and reality was blatant. The moment Mr. Chan heard this, he got to work immediately. A veteran talent scout knew better than to ignore anomalies like this. You don't see two rookies casually farming a 3-star dungeon every day. Most likely they were deliberately hiding their true level to avoid attention. While Mr. Chan set out to track down these talents, a curious discussion took place in another powerful guild. Thanks to citywide surveillance, the local boss had begun closely watching the two newcomers. He already had full profiles on both of them and was studying the data carefully. Standing beside him was his sister, the same untamed tigress named Yunhee. She knew Kang Woo-jin was unusual, but hadn't realized just how far that went. Either he had deliberately concealed his abilities during testing, or his growth rate was downright terrifying. At that pace, his potential could rival a local legend, the strongest hunter in Korea, Kim Kang-cheol. For now, such comparisons sounded ridiculous, but even legends once started at level 0. The Huarang Guild Master, Mr. Layson, ordered a meeting to be arranged with the young prodigy. As was becoming clear, storm clouds were slowly gathering around the main character. He was being noticed more and more, despite desperately wanting to stay in the shadows. Meanwhile, the allies decided to take a short break, drink some cold water, and eat a couple of sandwiches. In just a few days, the necromancer had earned enough to buy his mother a new house in a good neighborhood. When you carry this kind of talent, even the boldest dreams stop feeling like fantasy. But despite the success, he had no intention of slowing down. If anything, he wanted to accelerate, all to make sure that money came hand in hand with explosive growth and power. He needed to recover most of his lost necromancer skills as fast as possible. After all, you never know what kind of danger waits ahead. As a reward, the system granted him an additional warrior class. That wasn't great news, since staying a pure mage was far more profitable for a necromancer. Refusing the reward was no longer an option, and the system also granted him a new weapon. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary iron rod, but with each level it unlocked new potential. On top of that, he received a Demon Seal Catalyst. Demon Seals are magical crystals necromancers obtain as they progress. Each great crystal contains a powerful familiar, incomparable to ordinary skeletons. Commanding such beings elevates a necromancer to an entirely different tier. Using warriors like these, he had wiped out every enemy on Alphen, and now he intended to do the same on Earth. He activated the crystal immediately, eager to see what kind of monster was sealed inside. The result blew past every expectation, sending a cold shiver straight down the necromancer's spine. Instead of a monster, Bibi appeared, pure Baby Yoda vibes, cute on the surface, yet radiating the feeling she could wipe out a planet. It turned out she was one of his familiars left behind on planet Alphen. The girl had clearly missed her master and couldn't understand where he had vanished to. Suddenly, her attention shifted as she caught a disgusting stench of rot and damp decay. One look at the fallen monsters was enough for Bibi to be sure. The smell belonged to Tranet's allies. From the hero's expression alone, it was obvious that name carried immense weight for him. Tranet was a demon who had invaded Alphen from a mysterious dimension. Relying on an endless army of parasites, he wiped out more than 90% of the population. Kang had never faced him personally, but he knew all too well how dangerous and cunning that monster was. It seemed Tranet had now set his sights on Earth, and that was the true reason dungeons had appeared. All this time, the hero believed he had escaped Hell, when in reality, Hell had simply followed him. By then, Mr. Chan was already standing at the dungeon entrance. Together with his assistant, Haman, he was carefully planning how to conduct negotiations. Then, the very same rookies emerged from the dungeon, making it clear the raid was over. Sangu looked like a walking corpse, while his boss scanned the surroundings with caution. Representatives of the Hammer Guild smiled and did everything they could to secure a new diamond for their roster. The necromancer didn't even bother listening, making it clear he wouldn't waste time on that. From the outside, he looked like a lunatic who trusted absolutely no one. Kang made it clear that if they kept pushing him, he wouldn't hesitate to show his dark side. After all that negativity, he needed to blow off steam and decided to give his mother a special gift. She couldn't believe for a long time that the massive house now belonged to her. Years of hardship, hunger, and poverty were finally left behind. Her eldest son not only bought her a spacious home, but also transferred a solid sum to her bank account. He explained that he had started working as an adventurer and promised to be extremely careful. No matter how worried she was, refusing such generous gifts was almost impossible. The family finally breathed in the scent of freedom and forgot about debt. With family matters settled, it was time to think about something bigger. Kang decided to meet with his familiar again and talk everything through properly. Bibi could transform into a small kitten to avoid drawing attention with her devilish wings. The master tried to understand how the energy of an evil demon had even reached his home planet. Was it really true that nothing could be done now and Tranet would conquer Earth? There were no answers yet, only waiting and hoping for the best remained. By that time, Kang was no longer alone. Another guild representative had tracked him down. This one was the leader of one of the strongest factions, bold enough to come in person. While he tried to convince the necromancer to join his team, Sangu was having his own moment of joy. After years of driving an old family car, change had finally arrived for him. As a kid, he dreamed of owning the coolest ride in town to cruise around with beautiful girls. Now the dream was real. Only the paperwork stood between him and the keys to a brand new BMW. He was shining brighter than DiCaprio with an Oscar, like pulling a legendary drop on the first loot roll. After this news, the story shifted back to the main hero. Today, Kang looked unusually calm and clearly had no intention of starting a fight. He agreed to talk with the man who introduced himself as Yoonhee's brother. Unlike his sister, Mr. Layson was calm, tactful, and attentive. He carried the confidence and cold calculation of a seasoned strategist. He made it clear right away that he was interested in young talent and ready to finance the necromancer's growth. If Kang joined his team, money would flow in faster than it could be spent. The offer was tempting, but even that wasn't enough to make Kang bend his principles. He had no desire to follow someone else's orders or share profits with outsiders. To apply some pressure, the guild boss reminded him that more than 5 years had already passed since the dungeons first appeared. The monster kept growing bigger and stronger, while humanity still failed to grasp the true cause of the catastrophe. The scariest part was that it barely frightened anyone anymore. After all, dungeons had become a source of income. If this kept going, the world would spiral into chaos, and someone would have to stop it. The guild boss's main goal was to assemble a squad of the strongest awakened, capable of sealing every dungeon. If Kang entrusted them with his power, that goal would stop sounding like a fantasy. The offer struck a nerve, and he promised at least to think it over. Meanwhile, the Hammer Guild had no intention of backing off. That man didn't accept rejection. Being nicknamed Eric Cartman sounded more like a diagnosis than a joke. The same day, he learned that the young prodigy had booked yet another subway station. On top of that, the two of them were planning to clear a 4-star dungeon today. Either they had completely lost their minds, or their growth had gone far beyond common sense. With such a low rank, entering a dungeon like that was officially forbidden. The only way in was as a miner or support staff, which required guild membership. A plan instantly formed in Mr. Chan's mind on how to turn the situation to his advantage. He did everything possible to cancel the dungeon reservation and ordered a car to be prepared. At the same time, Sangu was already driving his boss to the mission, sitting behind the wheel of his brand new BMW. The two had grown closer and talked like people who'd known each other for years. The comfort of the car eased the tension, especially knowing they'd soon dive back into a world of demonic creatures. Upon arriving at the subway station, they ran into an administrator who flatly forbade entry into the portal. According to him, these two adventurers were far too weak for such a pass, and the raid was off the table. Sangu tried his hardest to persuade the administrator, even hinting at a bribe, but it went nowhere. They were already ready to turn around and leave empty-handed, searching for another dungeon. And right at that moment, Mr. Chan appeared out of nowhere with his assistant. This time, he knew exactly what to do and how to steer the conversation. He calmly explained that the dungeon belonged to his guild, and all previous reservations were canceled. If Kang and his partner truly wanted to clear it, their chance was right here and now. Mr. Chan called it a gesture of goodwill. though in reality it was a carefully calculated Grandmaster move. Before the raid even started, he decided to present a special gift. The seasoned captain hurried to his car, opened the trunk, and pulled out a mysterious bag. He asked for nothing in return, fully aware that favors rarely go unanswered. He was confident his experience would be enough to gradually pull the rookies to his side. Today, Kang behaved noticeably calmer than the day before. He even looked friendly, as if yesterday's inner demon had vanished without a trace. That was because after meeting Bibi, his thoughts revolved around Trinette, and today he deliberately pushed that aside. The moment Kang became more agreeable, Haman assumed the plan was guaranteed to succeed. This young and ambitious employee had long dreamed of a career breakthrough, and now the chance was closer than ever. All that remained was to wait for the raid to end, invite the hunter to a cafe, and slide the right papers over after a couple of drinks. He failed to understand one thing: pretty words don't work on people like that. Someone who survived hell always judges actions, not loud promises. When Mr. Chan returned with the gifts, the hunters were already inside the dungeon. They hadn't waited for him, and the man nearly snapped in frustration. That was because he planned to hand them a full survival kit. Without such gear, rookies stand almost no chance in a 4-star dungeon. Normally, raids like this require a full team of experienced adventurers. No matter how talented, these two were objectively not ready for such conditions. Plenty of overconfident hunters had already challenged 4-star dungeons. Out of hundreds, only a handful ever made it back home. There was no doubt left. Dreams of cooperation could be tossed straight into the trash. These two wouldn't return, and now Mr. Chan was certain of it. While he blamed himself for hesitating, the necromancer and his partner were already surveying the subway interior. Every monster around had already been wiped out, yet the return stone stubbornly refused to appear. The situation felt off, especially when a massive, all-devouring portal tore open in a dark alley nearby. In their right mind, only a complete psycho or someone with zero survival instinct would step into that thing. Naturally, Kang and Sangu went straight in. The moment they crossed the threshold, they found themselves in the middle of mysterious jungles, completely naked. All gear and equipment had vanished, leaving the two guys stripped bare and totally exposed. Sangu looked like a lost middle schooler, while his boss resembled a Zeus statue that had somehow been dropped into Fortnite. That's what happens when you break into a 4-star dungeon with no prep and no plan. Without hesitation, Kang burned experience points just to buy himself basic clothes. He was only level 10 for now, but sheer experience made his skills hit far harder than those of normal rookies. That gave them a real shot at clearing the place, though relaxing for even a second would have been suicide. Just minutes later, pushing through the jungle somehow turned into pure fun. A massive, deadly crocodile burst from the bushes like it had been patiently waiting for guests. Kang charged it like an old friend he hadn't seen in years. Instead of a hug, he calmly took its head off and casually considered turning the hide into a new bag. Meanwhile, up on the surface, Mr. Chan had fully descended into paranoia. He kept repeating that he had lost one of the most valuable talents of an entire generation. The guild captain was convinced the rookies would never crawl out of that portal alive. In his imagination, monsters were tearing them apart and turning them into a late-night snack. Reality, however, was telling a completely different story. The young hunters felt almost at home in the jungle, like it was their natural habitat. They casually killed a few monsters and even managed to cook something resembling barbecue. After a short break, they moved on again, diving deeper into the dangerous greenery. The farther they went, the more often deadlier creatures crossed their path. To scatter an entire army of monkeys, fireball skills had to come out. Sangu didn't even step in, just watched as the undead handled everything. Summoning a squad of skeleton mages was enough to calmly cleanse the jungle of filth. The assistant wasn't shy about asking questions, trying to understand how his boss survived so confidently in the wild. The necromancer admitted honestly that he had spent over 20 years in a world like this. Here, he felt at home, and sometimes even caught himself missing Alphen. After overcoming all the jungle's traps, all that remained was to find the guardian of the return stone. Logically, this monster should have been the most dangerous enemy, forcing them to go all out. Yet when they found the stone, there wasn't a single enemy in sight. Inexperienced Sangu thought they'd gotten insanely lucky by skipping the final fight, and that was his mistake. Countless traps lay ahead where one wrong step could mean death. Only seconds passed before it became clear. There was no avoiding a battle. From the shadows emerged massive orcs with glowing eyes and blade-sharp teeth. Each one possessed high intelligence and serious martial training. Back on Alphen, Kang had fought orcs many times and had even learned their language. He immediately used that knowledge to understand why they were here. The orcs exchanged shocked glances. Clearly, they hadn't expected a human speaking the ancient tongue. It turned out they had lost their home after being defeated by a great demon. The balance of their world was shattered, and Tranit had promised to rule the entire galaxy. On his orders, the orcs came here, believing Earth would become the monster's new home. But the evil demon had overlooked one crucial detail. One of his old enemies was now defending Earth and had no intention of giving up his favorite planet. There were no loud speeches or insults. This challenge was decided in silence. Kang simply raised his weapon, and the orcs answered in kind, instantly rushing into battle. The air grew razor tense, and Sangu's knees started shaking from the pressure. And it was worth remembering that in the real world, time flowed by completely different rules. Only 5 hours had passed. Night fell, and someone else's patience finally snapped. The Hammer Guild staff had no more doubts. The young hunters were dead. Just as they were about to get into the car and leave, the dungeon portal suddenly vanished. Darkness swallowed everything, and no matter how hard they looked, not a single living soul could be seen. All that remained was to file a report and officially record the deaths of 2 adventurers. Mr. Chan was already rehearsing the talk with his wife about losing his bonus. Pure vibes of a trader who nuked his savings on Dogecoin. And right at that moment, his heart started pounding like crazy because a miracle happened. The very same adventurers appeared ahead, dragging an enormous pile of loot behind them. They looked like they had returned not from hell but from a casual evening walk. Without wasting time, the guys jumped into the car and immediately headed home. Driving through the empty nighttime streets, Kang suddenly noticed a familiar silhouette. He recognized his friend, the honor student Jamon, walking alongside a woman. They decided to stop and say hello. Too much connected them to just pass by. At first, it looked like the honor student had finally found a girlfriend and was on a date. But it was more complicated. Her name was Nuna, and she was his older sister. Once upon a time, she studied in the same class as Kang and had long stopped believing she would ever see him again. Meanwhile, Mr. Chan had already returned to the Hammer Guild headquarters. He met with the boss and confidently declared that he had found a true superstar. For talent like that, they were ready to offer any salary and title, like signing Messi at the end of the season. The boss promised to think it over and dismiss Mr. Chan. After that, he met with his assistant, Park Jin-woo, to discuss the fresh news. Park was one of those whose talent Mr. Chan had spotted at the very start of his career. He had brought many strong hunters into the guild, so his opinion always carried weight. Along the way, they discussed a strange incident in America that had been keeping everyone awake lately. The rumors were confirmed. Someone really had come out of a dungeon. To this day, no one knew who she truly was, except that the woman spoke no human language. She kept repeating mysterious words that no one could translate. The Americans were doing everything possible to establish at least some kind of contact. The operation was personally led by the head of the Titan Guild, a high-level Awaken named Dinkan. The irony was that it would take them a long time to realize the woman had been repeating a single name all along, Kang Woo-jin. After returning home, the honor student immediately sat down to study. But there were too many thoughts in his head to focus properly. Again and again he thought about his sister, hoping she was safe. He had real reasons for worry and doubt. His sister had agreed to meet a psychopath who had returned from the abyss. You never know what to expect from someone like that, so Nuna needed to be careful. Luckily, a third person was with them, Sangu, the assistant. They ordered plenty of food and drinks and spent the time warmly, reminiscing about the past. Back in school days, Nuna had been considered the main beauty of the neighborhood. With her looks, she drove guys crazy without even realizing it. Now she felt embarrassed remembering those times, as if that incident had changed her completely. She constantly wore a strange hat and flatly refused to take it off. At some point, Sangu noticed that his boss behaved oddly around women. It seemed he had never been in a relationship. After all, he'd spent his youth in another world. This clearly needed fixing, and the assistant was already ready to take action. He immediately suggested ordering more alcohol to lighten the mood. Everything went off the rails. Instead of fun, Sangu just got the most wasted. The boss gave him a harsh warning, making it clear that behavior like that could cost him a year's salary. At some point, the beauty couldn't take it anymore and fell asleep. The alcohol hit fast, and she clearly wasn't ready for it. Rolling onto her side, Nuna dropped her hat straight onto the floor. The locals immediately noticed her and started whispering, stealing glances in her direction. It turned out there was a scar on her face, one that made people feel awkward just looking at it. Everyone else looked away in embarrassment. Everyone except Kong, who calmly picked up the hat and gently placed it back on his friend's head. To him, she was still beautiful, even if that past incident had permanently changed her appearance. The next morning, Nuna woke up and couldn't figure out where she was or what had happened the night before. Lying in her brother's room, she pieced together last night's memories like a shattered puzzle. Her brother explained that she had drunk too much and just needed some rest. Once she felt better, she headed straight to the bathroom to wash up and clear her thoughts. There she remembered dropping her hat and how her childhood friend had carried her home in his arms. The thought made her uneasy. She had spent years carefully hiding the flaw on her face. After the monster attack, she'd gotten that scar and had avoided mirrors ever since. Realizing that Kang had seen her like that filled her with deep embarrassment. But her memory kindly reminded her that he still called her beautiful without hesitation. That thought made her smile and believe that the feelings from the past hadn't completely faded. Now it was time to rewind a little further and peek into the hero's youth. Back then, he was just an ordinary student with no power, titles, or insane abilities. His parents put school above everything and demanded that Kang always stay a top student. But one day, a problem appeared at school that flipped his world upside down. After meeting her, he could no longer focus on textbooks or grades. She was far too beautiful to think about anything else. Sometimes they stayed after class to clean the room, then wandered through the evening city together. The atmosphere of those days stayed in his heart as something warm and truly important. At some point, Nuna confessed her feelings to him, and Kang's heart nearly burst out of his chest. Emotions like that now visited him only in dreams. Waking up meant returning to a harsh reality where everything had long since changed. Lately, he had been renting a hotel room so he wouldn't crowd his mother and younger sister. Early in the morning, his assistant showed up and immediately started checking available dungeons. Almost all promising locations were already booked by major guilds. Clearing weak dungeons didn't appeal to him, so they had to look for unconventional options. Kang immediately called an old acquaintance and asked for help with the search. Mr. Chan seemed ready to rush over even in the dead of night, like a manager who just spotted the next Michael Jordan. He actually came through and quickly helped find a suitable place to grind. Together, they headed to the eastern part of the city and located the right portal. Before the raid, they noticed the dungeon was in a reconfiguration phase. Newbies didn't understand what that meant, but seasoned hunters grew grim at the word. Reporters and curious onlookers had already gathered near the problematic portal. Not long after, soldiers arrived and sealed off the area, letting no one through. Here, it helps to dive into the rules and understand how the system works. All dungeons are divided into 3 stages: mine, reconfiguration, and rupture. The dungeons Kang had cleared before were mines, allowing repeated raids. That stage lasts several months, after which limits kick in, and the portal enters reconfiguration. At that point, the strongest guilds race to seize the renewed dungeon first. Whoever clears it first officially becomes the owner. Mr. Chan warned that such dungeons are far more dangerous. The monster levels spike hard. A hunter without guild backing shouldn't even think about going in. Despite the risk, Kang was already imagining what it would be like to own his own dungeon. He was ready to step into chaos until he heard some bad news. The new dungeon consumed too much energy, and rookies simply weren't allowed inside. It looked like he'd have to admit that teamwork sometimes has its advantages. While the necromancer mulled this over, the crowd around them was already pulling out phones, snapping photos of the rising stars. These were the elite hunters of the Huarang Guild, arriving to take full control of the dungeon. Their polished, high-end gear instantly pulled every gaze in the area. And of course, it was impossible not to notice that very girl who seemed afraid of absolutely nothing. They had crossed paths before, and Yunhee had left behind a deeply unpleasant aftertaste. Now the necromancer had the perfect chance to settle the score. He had no intention of backing down and quickly came up with a way to slip into the dungeon. A crooked grin spread across his face as he deliberately started mocking the experienced, fearless woman. He teased her with sweet, borderline reckless words, clearly pushing buttons on purpose. Every move was pure provocation, calculated with a single goal: to get under her skin. No matter how hard she tried to keep her composure, this guy knew exactly how to dig deep. A crowd gathered fast, everyone eager to see what would happen to the one who dared anger the Princess of Death. Yunhee finally snapped, waved her hand, and roughly shoved the insolent fool aside. That was exactly what he had been waiting for. A single touch was enough for him to accidentally stumble and fall straight into the portal. Now, the administrator would have no questions. Everything could be logged as an accident. It was too late to react. The portal accepted its new victim and shut instantly. The assistant couldn't do a thing, left only to sip his latte and hope the boss would come back alive. In the next instant, the necromancer found himself in a scorching desert of another world. He geared up immediately and came face to face with the king of quicksand. A massive, foul-smelling sandworm crawled toward him, expecting easy prey. A perfect warm-up, and a good chance to cleanse the dungeon of worms at the same time. The plan cracked when it turned out the monster's hide could shrug off a sword strike. Worse still, the creature called in its entire family, and things got real fast. Giant worms surrounded him, squeezing in like a living trap. Suddenly, everything went silent, and a blinding flash made one thing clear. Today was a bad day for worms. The entire family was turned into minced meat by the power of the universal spear. The weapon grew alongside its master, step by step becoming a nightmare for monsters. In the distance, a new type of worm appeared, known here as balls. Even those couldn't scare an experienced necromancer. He was already imagining turning them into Nesquik chocolate balls for his morning milk. Blows rained down one after another, turning the desert into a full-scale battlefield. When it was over, the guy could barely stay on his feet from exhaustion. He had to use a purchased potion that instantly restored his health. His body stabilized, and he could move on toward the nearest city. All this time, intense public attention remained around the subway station. People didn't disperse and grew more impatient with every passing minute. Many openly called Kang an idiot for sticking his nose where it didn't belong. It nearly sparked a conflict. The assistant refused to tolerate insults aimed at his boss. He believed to the very end that the necromancer would pull through and come back. No matter what happened, the assistant was sure Kang would carry it on sheer grit and experience. Even Mr. Chan, despite his doubts, felt he was witnessing history in the making. If he survived, Korea would gain a new top tier, like a hidden Elden Ring boss entering the league. But it wouldn't be easy, since the number of monsters inside the dungeon kept rising. After the worms came the parasites hiding in the mountains. There was no way around using skeletons here. The enemies were simply too many. Closer to noon, the hunter finished the slaughter and reached an abandoned city. Once this place had been called Lucrezia. Trade once thrived here. Travelers from every continent crossed paths, and rare artifacts were sold openly. The abandoned city only looked empty at first glance. Relax for even a second, and hidden creatures would tear your head clean off. Kang reacted just in time and came face to face with Nagas, the infamous serpent-like monsters. They looked like humans twisted into snakes, gifted with lethal abilities. These creatures didn't appreciate intruders stepping into their temple. They demanded he leave immediately, but Kang chose to dig deeper instead. The picture was becoming clear. A demon was pushing monsters out of Alphen and herding them straight toward Earth. During the exchange, it surfaced that even the blue-eyed priestess had intervened. Yet even she failed to negotiate with Tranit and was cast out onto Earth. It was shocking, but now wasn't the time to dig through old history. Monsters couldn't be allowed to invade Earth. This place needed a ruthless purge. Sensing danger, the Nagas instantly activated camouflage. To survive, the necromancer had to push his instincts to the absolute limit. Both sides went all in. Blades, screams, blood. No one planned to retreat. Even the skeletons evolved mid-fight, manifesting new weapons and attacking far more aggressively. Invisible strikes quickly turned into a serious threat, becoming harder to track by the second. He had to constantly spin his head, catch every sound, and squeeze his reactions to the edge. That barely held, until archers joined in from above, perched on rooftops. The sheer number of enemies crushed in from all sides, making it nearly impossible to regain momentum. The Nagas were clearly stronger and completely at home in close combat. Even combat-grade skeletons could no longer turn the tide. That left only one path to survival. All of Korea was glued to their screens. A rookie had charged into territory usually reserved for people with Andrew Tate-level confidence and the same level of planning. His name was dragged across every channel with zero expectations of a happy ending. Even so, the bosses of major guilds held their breath, hoping this guy was truly different. Everyone thought about their own gain, and only a few genuinely worried about a living human. Sangu couldn't even eat properly. The tension twisted his stomach into knots. He'd grown too attached to his boss to pretend he didn't care. By now, every skeleton had been completely destroyed. They failed to protect their master, leaving him alone against the Serpent Lord. That was exactly the goal. Careful pressure had forced the boss out of hiding. The moment it happened, the bluff collapsed, and the demonic stone automatically raised his level. From here on, jokes were over. This wasn't GTA with cheats anymore, but a mode where mistakes cost more than deleting a TikTok account with 1 million followers. The necromancer instantly summoned the dead servant of the shifting sands. The massive corpse charged into battle, obeying every command without hesitation. The serpent army immediately lost its confidence. They began to fall back, and the noise of battle across the city slowly faded. Monsters that had been seconds from victory completely lost control of the fight. Only their boss remained, already realizing the plan had gone to hell. The desert was too hot for two. Someone had to stay here forever. The necromancer activated a skill and transformed another weapon. A clash between two elite fighters promised to be brutal and fast. Using a vortex technique, the hunter shattered the veteran serpent's defense. He carved the enemy with wounds and prepared to end it. The boss clung to life in desperation, like a child reaching for a last toy. It transformed into a giant anaconda and tried to swallow its opponent whole. A desperate move, but far too predictable. The necromancer struck first and officially cleared yet another monster-infested city. The center fell silent. Reporters were already crafting headlines like "I-Show-Speed YouTube drama, loud, dumb, and built around a corpse in the thumbnail." Then a flash of light made everyone gasp. The guy already declared dead walked out of the dungeon. Paparazzi cameras fired non-stop, while a close friend rushed in for an embrace. After a brief greeting, it was time to deal with the woman responsible for all this chaos. Without Yunhee, clearing this dungeon would have been impossible, so on paper she genuinely deserved praise. Her face made it obvious how badly she wanted to grab his neck and rip his Adam's apple clean out. But there were too many witnesses around, so revenge had to be postponed. Meanwhile, the boss of the Hammer Guild was already getting ready to go home, exhausted by non-stop calls from his furious wife. He was almost dressed when news came in that the guy had actually made it out of hell alive. Holding a 5th-level dungeon solo was like walking into a mob of crypto bros and realizing they had no plan, no brains, and no exit. It became obvious. This guy had reached a high rank and would soon join the strongest adventurers in Korea. That meant Mr. Chan had been absolutely right to offer the rookie a high position and a fat paycheck. Even blindfolded, he could sniff out talent, and he'd proven it more than once. If Hammer secured this new superstar, the guild would easily become the best in the country. From that moment on, the boss had no doubts left and was ready to pay any price for the kid. Their main rival, the Huarang Guild, wasn't planning to waste time either. Its boss was meeting with a minister, calmly discussing the progress of their shared interests. Preparations were complete, and plans were finally taking real shape. During the quiet conversation, Lai-san received a message from his sister. He couldn't even imagine that the guy he'd spoken with recently had single-handedly wiped out every monster in a lethal dungeon. Now Huarang was joining the hunt as well, and for that Lai-san was ready to ask the minister for a favor. Several days passed before the main hero even started thinking about new missions. All that time, he simply rested and enjoyed the silence of his friend's apartment. Jamon studied hard for his exams and was openly irritated by all the chaos. There were way too many strangers in his home now, none of whom he had invited. Kang would have gladly gone outside, but reporters were camping there around the clock. They bombarded him with questions and dragged him into pointless interviews. Even his mom had already found out that her son had become famous. Instead of joy, it only gave her new reasons to worry. She reminded him that fame always comes with responsibility, and Kang needed to be careful. During the same conversation, it turned out he'd received a draft notice for the army. Korea was still divided, and no one had solved that problem yet. All of this was starting to seriously piss him off, and his thoughts grew more aggressive by the day. Sometimes it felt like the easiest solution was just to take out Kim Jong-un and wipe out half the world's problems in one move. The necromancer was almost ready to reunify Korea himself, but Sangu managed to stop him. You can't just kill a dictator who's always one step away from a nuclear button. They had to look for another path, colder, smarter, more calculated. Sangu suggested a solution, explaining that the system worked differently. Awakened hunters weren't sent to fight like regular soldiers. If a hunter didn't want to serve in the army, they could still benefit the country another way. All it took was joining a guild and carrying out missions tied to national security. The plan made sense if you ignored the fact that Kang preferred to work solo. The boss lit up like a LinkedIn startup guru everyone suddenly believed in. No product, no ideas, just a perfect smile. A few hours later, great news hit the Hammer Guild. Mr. Chan couldn't believe how perfectly everything was lining up. That morning, the necromancer had agreed to a meeting and a talk about cooperation. It looked like he was ready to join the guild and accept their terms. For Chan, it was a full-on triumph, promising a massive bonus. Head held high, he headed to the meeting, completely confident in his negotiation skills. Before that, he needed to report to the boss. Hearing the good news, the boss immediately started shaking his hand and thanking him for the excellent work. He brightened up instantly, like someone who just realized they wouldn't have to pay their debts after all. They chose a familiar spot for the meeting, a cafe near the necromancer's place. But from the very first second, everything went off script, and the illusion shattered like fragile glass. It turned out Kang had no intention of joining a guild and instead planned to build his own dream team from scratch. He immediately named the people he wanted to work with, knowing full well that pulling this off solo was impossible. Mr. Chan and his assistant's first reaction were clear disappointment. They had expected a completely different outcome. But the moment they heard the concrete benefits, their expressions flipped instantly. Each of them was promised double the salary and a fast track up the career ladder. Kang offered them co-founder status in a new major guild, one meant to seize real power in the country over time. The conversation ended in heavy silence, like Mark Zuckerberg right after being asked why anyone needs a metaverse headset that costs half a paycheck. Young and ambitious Haman didn't hesitate for a second. He was in. The second big money entered the picture. Every remaining tie to the Hammer Guild vanished from his mind. Now the decision rested solely with Mr. Chan, who had worked in the same place for years without change. Considering how fast the necromancer was growing in power, refusing cooperation would have been straight up stupid, especially since the Hammer Guild had been stagnant for ages, with everyone stuck in the same roles. He no longer wanted to stay a background assistant and dreamed of becoming someone who shaped the fate of an entire organization. At that moment, the decision fully formed in his head. He was in as well. Only formalities remained, informing the boss it was over and clearing out the office. Even that supposedly simple step turned into a mountain of problems and stress. When they returned to the office, they were greeted by confetti and loud congratulations. Every employee of the guild had gathered to celebrate Chan's supposedly successful negotiations. It wasn't a joke or a prank, just a massive misunderstanding. The stunned man forced a smile while barely holding back tears inside. He had no idea how to tell the truth and announce his resignation now. The boss refused to listen, the celebration rolled on, and no one seemed to notice Chan's tension. Every minute made him more anxious as he searched for the right moment to speak up. The pressure kept rising until the boss finally approached him directly. All that was left was to exhale and unload everything he'd been holding in. A few minutes later, the boss learned the mission had failed and the young superstar wouldn't be joining them. He exploded, shouting and accusing Chan of total unprofessionalism. Then he even threatened to fire him, and Chan seized the moment instantly. He calmly agreed to leave the position and placed his resignation letter on the table. For the sake of working with the new star, Chan had risked everything, even paying association staff to adjust the necromancer's rank. He'd gone into debt, constantly booking dungeons under his own name, and was close to selling his car. After all that, staying in the guild and missing this chance would have been pure stupidity. The decision was final, and the opinions of the boss or other employees no longer mattered. From that day on, the Hammer Guild lost a specialist who could find talent even where none seemed to exist. Two friends stood at the edge of a new chapter with zero guarantees of success. They took the risk and officially joined the newly formed Adral Guild. Why that name was chosen, not even the gods could explain. From that moment on, they became partners and stopped worrying about formalities. Kang wasn't nervous at all, confidently repeating that Adral would quickly become the best guild in the world. He was dangerously carefree and barely understood how this business actually worked. First, they had to put all the small details aside and focus on one major issue. Building a guild took more than just gathering close friends. The team needed a broader staff, meaning they had to push hard and recruit new people. The necromancer greedily scrolled through his phone contacts, which were few to begin with. Soon, he found a suitable option and decided this person would be perfect for office work. The next morning, a typical scammer received a call from his former customer. Hun had no idea how this would end, but fear pushed him to show up anyway. He brought all his documents, and that same day became a full-fledged member of the Adral Guild. Donut still couldn't believe it. Yesterday he was scamming pensioners. Today he was launching a career. The classic origin story of a future billionaire straight out of a Bezos playbook. A few days later, the new team found a suitable office space and rented it long-term. Everything looked surprisingly solid and respectable, even though it had required a serious cash burn. Not long ago, Donut was convinced this was all a prank and wouldn't last. And it all started when he sold a phone to a dangerous guy who never forgives mistakes. Now that same guy was constantly on TV, and Donut found himself carrying out his orders. After a brief moment of thought, Hun realized this kind of job could bring in real money. He was sick of a salesman's minimum wage and wanted actual growth for once. Turns out even a casual beating can be the opening chapter of a weird and massive career arc. A bit later, the boss gathered all the founders in his office for a serious talk. It was time to assign positions and clearly define everyone's responsibilities. Kang had zero clue about corporate structure, so he suggested everyone pick their own lane. Any guild splits into two groups, Awaken hunters and regular staff. For hunters, the key things are contracts, stable income, and fat bonuses. After hearing all the details, the boss immediately appointed his assistant as director. Sangu was thrilled, feeling like he'd finally grabbed luck by the tail. That joy vanished fast when he learned he'd be director of resource collection, which basically meant hard labor, gathering materials and hauling them on his own back. Mr. Chan took the role of general manager, leaning on years of experience. Haman became head of support, responsible for all internal operations. Things were far more complicated with Donut. He had no idea how the guild world worked, and it wasn't clear why he was even there. He'd been brought in just to help found the organization, and after that he seemed unnecessary. Since he stayed, they decided to give him a job, kind of like giving Drake another hit. Nobody's sure why, but sure, why not? Once positions were settled, the boss proposed the first mission. He needed to complete a raid to get out of mandatory military service. That's when it became clear this was the real reason the guild even existed. Mr. Chan hesitated for a moment, realizing things might have gone differently at his old job. But it was too early for regrets. Big wins were still ahead. Lately, the necromancer had become the hottest topic across the entire country. For Nuna, it felt unreal seeing her former classmate as a national superstar. She still remembered the night he carried her home in his arms. Those memories warmed her heart and gave her hope. But harsh reality kept pulling her back. Dorm residents constantly reminded her to wear a hat and hide the scar. Because of that, she felt broken again and forgot about her dreams. All she could do was stay patient and believe things would change soon. Her brother was supposed to visit today, and they'd planned to go see a movie together. On his way to his sister, he accidentally overheard two women talking in the dorm. Jamon instantly realized they were discussing his sister and her appearance. His chest tightened, and in that moment he firmly decided to help his beloved sister. Meanwhile, the necromancer finished clearing yet another dungeon. He and his assistant stepped out to face a crowd of reporters and ran straight into Donut. Today, Donut was working as a personal driver and had even put on a suit for the job. The journalists ignored all boundaries, trampling over people for a headline interview. A man who'd spent his life selling phones was completely unprepared for this chaos. Still, he chose to gamble and use the opportunity. Hun had no intention of going back to the old shop and selling phones for the rest of his life. He snapped and started screaming at the reporters, forbidding them from even touching his boss. He yelled so loud that spit flew everywhere, and strangely enough, it worked. The reporters backed off and didn't dare mess with him again. The boss finally exhaled and realized he'd hired the right person after all. Within a few days, everyone had settled into the guild and wrapped up all the paperwork drama. Today, Kang sat in the office, scrolling through fresh newspaper headlines. Almost every journalist predicted him a legendary future, some even comparing him to Korea's top hunter. The thought of facing such a rival was tempting, but right now he had other priorities. Suddenly, Jamon knocked on the door, coming in to ask for help. Just minutes later, Jamon left so quickly it felt like he was embarrassed by his own request, leaving tension hanging in the room. He had looked dead serious, clearly asking the necromancer for something important. After that, Kang started picking out neat clothes and mentioned he was going on a date with Nuna. Donut caught that instantly, and a plan was born in his head on the spot. Officially, he'd been assigned as the plant manager, the guy in charge of office greenery. But he wanted more, so he immediately declared he'd help set up the perfect date. Without wasting time, they headed to a clothing store to build the right look. At first, it all felt like a joke, and Kang was clearly out of his comfort zone. He didn't understand why there were so many steps, and quickly regretted trusting an inexperienced guy. Just an hour earlier, Hun had sworn he was a romance expert. He claimed to know dozens of ways to charm a girl, repeating that sincerity and first impressions were everything. According to him, full trust in his advice guaranteed success. The necromancer decided to risk it anyway, fully aware that trusting a professional scammer was basically shooting himself in the foot. The result turned out insanely good, like the outfit had been picked by Taylor Swift's stylist on a rare perfect day. In the new suit, the adventurer looked straight out of John Wick. All that was left was to add a watch and walk toward destiny. Donut even wrote a note detailing the full plan for the perfect date. At least now the boss didn't have to overthink the evening himself. Sangu planned to chill peacefully, which couldn't be said for Donut. He was dead set on helping the boss and refused to stop at generic advice. This had to be a truly perfect night, and that meant effort. He dashed outside and grabbed the first taxi he saw to get downtown. Meanwhile, Nuna had no idea this evening would turn out special. She got a message from her childhood friend and learned he wanted to meet. Stepping onto the balcony, she saw him in a sharp suit, like he'd just walked off the set of a new James Bond movie. Nuna had always been insecure, so she couldn't bring herself to wear a dress. Even meeting a friend, she kept her cap on, hiding the scar. Kang noticed immediately and realized it was time to change something. He walked into a nearby shop and suggested buying 2 stylish masks. She looked him in the eyes and decided this was someone she could trust. Minutes later, they were already running toward the local cinema. Passers-by turned their heads in surprise at the mysterious pair. Once the masks were on, the awkwardness faded away. Kang escaped the clingy reporters, and Nuna escaped thoughts about her flaw. From there, things started happening that were hard to call coincidence. Looking closer, it became clear the theater was empty except for them. And that wasn't random. That only happens when someone deliberately buys out every seat. When the necromancer approached the ticket counter, he was told there were no tickets left. They were disappointed and even considered another cinema. At that moment, a guy in a strange mask walked up and handed them 2 tickets for free. He didn't give his name and bolted immediately, like he was afraid of interrupting the date. Kang noted the guy looked suspiciously like one of his employees but didn't dwell on it. Donut instantly ran off to refund the tickets, since he was the one who'd bought out the whole theater. Minutes before the screening, he was already demanding his money back. Old habits die hard. The movie itself went perfectly, and afterward they decided to take a walk. The street was flooded with lights, music, and noise, and right in the middle of that chaos, a local clown offered a simple but tempting game. All it took was a small fee and a bit of blind faith in luck, just like in every place built to drain wallets. Nuna talked her friend into trying, and somehow they hit the jackpot on the very first attempt. Usually these games spit out cheap trinkets, but this time the prize was on a completely different tier. When the game ended, the clown took off his glasses and winked, looking like Elon Musk after announcing another genius idea no one asked for. It was Donut himself, going all out for his boss, even if that meant putting on clown makeup. The evening flew by like someone hit fast forward, feeling like a perfect stretch of time with zero heavy thoughts. They wandered through shops, laughed, talked, and reminisced about school days, as if the world had never known pain. Later, they stopped by a small restaurant for dinner, catching their breath after the long walk. The date was slowly coming to an end, but the most important moment of the night was still ahead. Nuna felt light and free, as if she'd briefly returned to a past where the scar didn't chain her body or mind. A strange warmth hung in the air, and she looked into the eyes of the man who seemed like the most beautiful person in the world. Right then, fireworks lit up nearby, their beauty so overwhelming that words felt useless. Out of nowhere, people holding flowers appeared and froze in place, like they were waiting for a prearranged signal. But everything went off script the moment Nuna took off her mask. People noticed the scar and began exchanging glances, curiosity written all over their faces. The awkwardness shattered the mood instantly, and it was clear how she closed herself off again. That's when Kang used his abilities to shield her from the stares and noise of the outside world. He wrapped her in a sealed space and calmly said he had a surprise for her. None of this was random. Jamon had asked him earlier to help his sister. He explained that after their parents' death, she had changed deeply and shut herself away. She stopped smiling and enjoying life, and he begged him to do whatever it took to bring the light back to her eyes. The necromancer found a solution and didn't hesitate to buy a magical restoration potion. This ointment could heal any wound, even scars that had lingered for years. He carefully explained how to use it and asked her not to wash it off until morning, promising the result would be special. After the date, he walked her home, wished her a calm night, and left without rushing. Thinking back on the evening, she couldn't hold back her happiness, even though it had started as a simple walk with a school friend. Only later did she remember the gift she'd received from the clown. Opening the box, she found a ring with a neat, stunning diamond. In that instant, every event of the day replayed in her mind. Now it was clear. The evening really had been special. The people with flowers during the fireworks had clearly been waiting for something specific. The ring pulled all the scattered pieces into one picture. Most likely he'd planned to propose, but everything derailed at the last second. In reality, it was all Donut's doing. He had wildly overestimated his event planning skills. The next day, he had to apologize for getting way too involved. If he stuck his nose in again, he'd be sent right back to selling phones. Hun genuinely wanted to help, but sometimes knowing when to stop is the real skill. Meanwhile, Mr. Chan had already struck a deal with the Ministry of Defense. If the necromancer completed 10 mobilization missions, military service would be off the table. They had to start immediately. A dungeon breach had already occurred in a neighboring city. The necromancer arrived on site at once, by which point most residents had already been evacuated. The city looked empty and dead, making it the perfect moment to explain what a dungeon breach really meant. If a dungeon isn't cleared within a month, the barrier collapses and monsters spill out. That was exactly what happened here. The dungeon proved too difficult. If the monsters fully break free, chaos will erupt and wipe out everything around it. Preventing that requires serious preparation and precision. Assisting the necromancer was First Lieutenant Chahi from a special defense unit. They agreed to drop formalities and move fast to stop a catastrophe. The breach was scheduled for tomorrow, which meant there was still time. To stop the catastrophe, the dungeon had to be cleared, but reality hit way harder than anything written on paper. Elite squads had already gone in before, only to stall out and retreat with nothing to show for it. Even when multiple teams linked up, the run still collapsed into a full failure. International forces were called in as a last resort, but even that didn't flip the script. In theory, the breach could still be prevented, yet no one left was willing to gamble their life. Now everyone was bracing for the worst-case scenario, fighting monsters after they spill into the real world. Not just adventurers, but professional soldiers were being prepped for that nightmare. The plan leaned hard on new tech and heavy firepower, aiming to erase anything that crawled out of the portal. No matter how scary the monsters were, a missile to the face was expected to solve problems like a Terminator plot fixes drama. From the outside, it looked like the soldiers didn't fully grasp what they were about to face. When real Alphan Titans showed up, calling for backup would be as useless as praying during a Godzilla movie. Kang decided to head to the elite hunter team waiting for the dungeon breach. This was where the best of the best had gathered, people ready to die for their country. Among them stood a familiar face, aggressive, fearless, and still devastatingly beautiful Yoon-hee. She hadn't forgotten past grudges, and not long ago she'd had a serious talk with her brother. The head of the Huarang Guild had asked his sister for a favor. It involved a talented necromancer and demanded total commitment. He believed his sister could pull it off, bringing them closer to their long-term goals. Tension hung thick between Kang and Yoon-hee even before a single word was exchanged. Everyone nearby stiffened, expecting the long-standing conflict to erupt into bloodshed. One spark was all it would take to blow the whole powder keg sky high. Each of them was ready to go all the way, just to prove who the real top talent in Korea was. The lieutenant had to step in and cool down 2 walking time bombs. The situation stabilized for the moment, and that's when the necromancer made his move. He requested detailed intel on the dungeon on the verge of breaching. For someone like Yoon-hee, it didn't take long to read what this sly operator was planning. Minutes later, armed with the data, he headed straight for the subway station. A 6th-level dungeon didn't scare him. He came in planning to solo clear it and stop the breach himself. His rival followed and demanded he stop immediately. She understood his plan perfectly and knew he was far sharper than he looked. He had no intention of waiting for a full breach and then cleaning up the mess with everyone else. Going in first, clearing the dungeon, and claiming the reward made far more sense. No one had forbidden it, and on top of that, it could save innocent lives. Kang calmly stepped into the portal, fully aware this move would push Yoon-hee over the edge. At the same time, her older brother was casually playing golf in his office, clueless about the chaos unfolding. When the call came in, he first assumed it was a bad joke. It was hard to believe his rational, battle-hardened sister had entered a 6th-level dungeon without backup. From the outside, it looked like she'd lost her mind, or someone had deliberately provoked her. Either way, both were already inside, each determined to claim the prize for themselves. The necromancer held a clear advantage. He could rely on an army of the dead. They split up to explore the territory separately. Yoon-hee had been here before and knew what kind of lethal creatures lurked in these forests. Much of it caught Kang off guard, but backing down was never an option. Having come this far, he intended to see it through and enjoy every second of it. A massive monster quickly learned that sheer size alone meant nothing. Using his summoned hammer, Kang shattered the skull of the hulking orc. By then, alongside Bibi, he had summoned another familiar. It was Rocky, a stone monster capable of smashing through walls with its own head. Together, they pushed forward in search of the returned stone. Before long, the forest path led them to a place that immediately felt different. The necromancer had heard of this place before. Back on Alphen, legend spoke of a sacred land rising into existence. This massive slab of stone was known as the Tarda Plateau, also called the Temple of Giants. By constantly clearing dungeons and grinding levels, the necromancer had made serious progress. He had learned to harvest the souls of fallen monsters and bend them to different purposes. For example, he could reshape his spear, reforging it into a full-fledged sword mid-battle. Those same souls also allowed him to summon extra familiars, including ones capable of flight. Blinding beams of light flooded the area, followed by the familiar echo of hooves striking stone. That was how Shin Shin appeared, a spectral horse, loyal to the core and always ready to answer his master's call. With Shin Shin, crossing bottomless chasms and scaling impossible heights became trivial. Things were going far worse for the aggressive lady. She kept running into monsters and had no dead army to back her up. Only her shadow break technique let her escape danger again and again with her life intact. After cutting down dozens of creatures, she finally reached the edge of the forest. That was when it hit her. The rival was clearly ahead. He had too many tricks, too many tools that kept him one step in front at all times. The reason hunters had failed to clear this dungeon before turned out to be simple. They couldn't cross the abyss. Only a handful possessed flight abilities, and even that offered no guaranteed success. Beyond the chasm, the return stone was guarded by three high-level monsters. In the end, hunters had been forced to retreat, warn the government, and prepare in advance for rebuilding the city. For guilds, that meant future big money. Construction and reconstruction always came with fat profits. Yunhee had never wanted to meddle in her brother's political games, but today it was a matter of pride. If the Huarang Guild couldn't clear the dungeon while some solo operator nearly did it alone, that was pure humiliation. To prevent that outcome, the necromancer had to be stopped before finishing the job. In the real world, only 1 hour remained before the dungeon breach. An emergency press conference was hastily assembled to answer the public's questions. Panic ruled the room as everyone demanded clear explanations from the head of the Huarang Guild. He sweated and stumbled over his words like a politician in a bad thriller, shoved in front of a mic with zero prep. Liason genuinely didn't know what to say, especially with his sister now facing mortal danger. The conference had to be cut short, ending with a nervous retreat into the hallway. In truth, his concern for his sister was mostly an act. Yunhee was a pawn, and what he feared most was his political chessboard collapsing. By then, a massive crowd had gathered near the portal. The loudest of all were the necromancer's allies, calling themselves the Adral Guild. They shouted for answers, demanding to know where their boss was. Panic ruled them too, yet they waited. If Kang was alive, he would show up. Right now, dozens of stone monsters stood before him, not yet rushing to attack. One step forward was all it took for those statues to spring to life. They surrounded the hunter instantly, making it clear the path was sealed. A trap like this was hardly enough to scare someone who had survived far worse. Yunhee chose not to interfere, watching from a tree in cautious silence. It was her first time seeing the necromancer fight as a pure warrior. It looked like he had a dual class, and that gave him a massive edge. When she had faced these creatures herself, barely escaping required calling in allies. Kang struggled as well, and if he wanted to make it in time, speed was everything. The stone golems had to be destroyed, or reaching the return stone was impossible. The stone itself was guarded by three cyclopes who had long forgotten how to smile. One look into their cold eyes made it clear these guys had zero sense of humor. Only after 10 grueling minutes were all the stone statues finally smashed apart. Familiars had to be summoned, or the fight would have dragged on forever. The returned stone shone brighter and brighter, screaming one thing loud and clear. The moment of the dungeon breach was almost here. There was no time left. He had to move fast, or innocent lives would be lost on the surface. Cyclopes were a race descended from the ancient giants. Though they shared roots with ogres, Cyclopes were not as savage or feral. They were lucky enough to inherit the wisdom of giants who once thrived as a true civilization. Their raw power made them more than worthy of being the final bosses guarding this temple. It turned out the Cyclopes knew the necromancer and called him the Immortal. He was known as the King of Death, which made their resolve absolute. The Cyclopes gripped their enchanted weapons, ready to grind this man into dust. Not the best way to start negotiations, but Rocky stepped in just in time and shielded his boss. Kang was still trying to figure out why the Cyclopes had ended up so far from their homeland. A demonic god was clearly involved, one who made a habit of ruining human lives. They said Trinet was the new order of the universe, and that his armies could not be stopped. The monsters had no intention of challenging him, which meant humans would have to handle it themselves. The first strike landed cleanly, the spear finding its mark with precision. The monster howled in pain but didn't stop, charging straight at the tiny ant before it. It succeeded. Two massive arms closed in, forming a living prison around the necromancer. He had escaped far worse places before, so he tore those bindings apart with ease. But then something strange happened. The Cyclops' arms and eye fully regenerated. With regeneration like that, the fight could drag on forever. By now, the military had already arrived at the metro station. Chaos was about to erupt, with only minutes left before the breach. Nuna was visibly shaking, praying non-stop that the man she loved would survive. And it truly wasn't easy, considering he was facing three cyclopes that couldn't be killed. Their gigantic bodies and instant regeneration only dragged the battle out longer. Even Yunhee had relaxed, deciding this guy was finally done for. He kept gambling again and again until it became clear every plan was collapsing. If defeat was inevitable, then the final move had to be a real all-in. Another thought surfaced, a theory capable of pulling off a miracle. This was the Temple of Giants after all, and the Cyclopes were merely its guardians. The master immediately ordered his familiars to stall the massive monsters at any cost. Bibi resisted until the very end, even though a blood contract could not be broken. She would have to obey the order no matter what, even if she ended up torn apart like a broken toy. While the demoness made big eyes like a Shrek character auditioning for a kid's movie, her boss did the grown-up work and climbed higher. He reached the head of a colossal statue and carefully scanned his surroundings. Most likely, the temple's divine relics were granting power to its guardians. If that theory was correct, the necromancer knew exactly how to strip the Cyclopes of their endless regeneration. He activated an earthquake technique and brought the massive statue crashing down. That stone titan had been the source of the Cyclopes' eternal life, and it had just been cut off. Now all that remained was to strike the true target and see what would happen next. In the same instant, a Cyclops lost its head, and a devilish grin spread across the necromancer's face. The regeneration was gone, and now things were finally getting interesting. From this moment on, the immortal set the rules, and the Cyclopes learned divine punishment the hard way. In less than 2 minutes, every last one of them was beheaded. A massive flood of experience, skills, and rewards poured in, earned through sheer ingenuity. All that was left was to claim the return stone, which had somehow vanished. Yunhee chose her moment perfectly and intercepted the crystal at the last second. What game was she playing now? Was this bold woman really challenging the immortal necromancer? Now it was time to recall her conversation with her brother, who had specifically asked her to lure Kang into the dungeon. This man was far too mysterious, and the time had come to expose his secrets. He needed to be watched, studied, and fully understood, every last one of his abilities. It was possible that powerful figures were hiding in the crowd, quietly backing him, and their names mattered just as much. His sister never wanted to become a rat or a spy, but orders from the top left her no choice. The problem was simple. Not long ago, Kang had founded his own guild. If his secret wasn't exposed, he would soon dominate the crystal market, the fattest money stream in the entire country. These crystals were pulled from dungeons and sold for insane cash, and guilds were ready to rip each other apart for them. They would gladly step over corpses if it meant protecting that absurd profit. All this time, they believed necromancers relied on hidden tricks or forbidden hacks. But in reality, he really had been holding dungeons solo. Instead of handing over the return stone and sealing the dungeon, Yunhee chose the path of blood. She had too many personal reasons to let this man walk out alive. He had crossed her path more than once, and now payback was overdue. Near the metro station, panic wasn't limited to the Adral Guild alone. Laysan himself looked uncertain, anxiety creeping in by the second. His sister had taken the necromancer's bait, and now the entire plan was close to collapse. Laysan reminded everyone that the breach was coming soon and that staying away was the smart move. He didn't want anyone diving into the dungeon to help the hunters. In truth, he only cared about his own benefit, even if that meant burying his sister for it. At that very moment, the barrier flared up and stopped responding to people. Mouths went dry, the crowd holding its breath as the finale approached. Just 5 minutes earlier, real hell had broken loose inside the dungeon. Two high-level fighters were battling with no intention of surviving together. Kang had his own reason to fight, revenge for the first loss of his career. It was impossible to forget that Yunhee had brutally beaten him after his return to Earth. He was far stronger now, but strength alone still didn't guarantee victory. They fought until the very last minute, momentum swinging back and forth non-stop. The Blood Princess pressed the attack relentlessly and even managed to crack the massive Rocky. Without ghostly armor, the same fate would have awaited the Necromancer himself. Their power was roughly equal, but Kang was clearly slower. When everything stacks against you, the only option left is to think and play dirty. Yunhee attacked too wide, making no effort to hide her rage. Sometimes that caused problems, but her movements were becoming easier to read. Blinded by the hunger to win, she completely forgot about basic defense. She lunged forward, already tasting victory. After this clear, she imagined herself as the main star, like the Squid Game finale where everyone else was just disposable extras. Dust exploded into the air and from it rose a dead skeleton. Kang had deliberately acted cornered, baiting her into believing in total dominance. All that remained was to wait for the summoned dead to arrive on time. They appeared from nowhere, razor blades flashing as they instantly pierced the target's guard. What followed was the final strike, clean, ruthless, and precise. Time seemed to freeze, then blood poured like a river. The Necromancer automatically reached level 50 and unlocked the ability to resurrect fallen familiars. The greatest rival on Earth had fallen, her cold heart stopping forever. After the barrier finally went silent, a single figure emerged from it. A wounded, exhausted Necromancer stepped out alone. His friends rushed toward him, checking his condition and celebrating the win. Seeing his face, they truly realized for the first time that even their boss was mortal. Only Nuna ignored all boundaries and threw herself into his arms. Choking on tears, barely breathing, she tried to make him understand that he had no right to risk himself like that. He hadn't heard words this warm in many years, and they melted something frozen deep inside him. In that moment, her scar was completely gone, proving the magic ointment had truly worked. She decided to bring up the gifted ring and confidently stated that she was ready to become his wife. The Necromancer didn't get it at all. It felt like he had been married off as suddenly as the Kardashians do it, fast, loud, and without his consent. Nuna explained everything that happened on the date and then admitted she had found a wedding ring inside the box. It was calmly clarified that she had misunderstood everything, and the girl instantly turned red with embarrassment. Donut, who was standing nearby, immediately realized it was time to vanish before things got worse. Today he was almost guaranteed to catch a couple of punches once the boss finished dealing with Layson. The air smelled like trouble, but Layson still had no real proof to accuse the Necromancer directly. Kang didn't dodge the issue and honestly said that Yunhee had died during the battle. He didn't specify who exactly killed her, a monster or a human. The conversation ended there, but rage flooded the man who had lost his sister. The dungeon breach never happened, and the dream of massive profits evaporated. On top of that, the guild boss lost his sister, and with her, his strongest adventurer. Now few would want to deal with him, branding him reckless and unreliable. And the cause of it all was the man known as the Immortal Necromancer. While Laysan swore revenge, Kang finally got a haircut, healed his wounds, and decided to rest. He still couldn't forget the powerful enemies from the 6th level dungeon. That was exactly the difficulty tier he had grown used to on the planet Alphen. Monsters like that would soon appear everywhere, and a way to stop it had to be found. Turning on the TV, he heard a mysterious professor explaining his view of the situation. The scientist warned that the monsters clearly came from another planet, and dungeons were nothing more than roads for them. The creatures used dungeons to reach Earth, but that wasn't the end of the story. Even after gates appeared, Monsters couldn't freely emerge because a full breach only happened after a month. Dr. James Toppler had his own theory connected to the Return Stone. That stone acted as a key, allowing passage to Earth. It sounded convincing even to someone who had spent decades on Alphen. At first, the monsters were weak because they weren't adapted to the new planet. Over time, they would adapt, grow stronger, and become far more dangerous. More and more 5th and 6th level dungeons were appearing, and this was clearly not the limit. Now the real question was why such a phenomenon had become possible at all. Dungeons weren't just mines. The red blood crystals were actually bait. The more of these crystals existed on Earth, the more suitable the planet became for monsters. The picture was disgusting. People happily swallowed the bait, smiling like customers who had just been expertly scammed. The energy inside those crystals was known as mana. Monsters rapidly increased Earth's mana level, creating perfect living conditions for themselves. James Toppler was right, but the necromancer didn't get to hear the rest. His assistant called, saying he urgently needed to come to a press conference. No one had warned him beforehand, and it clearly wasn't a coincidence. Someone had likely prepared a trap for the necromancer, and now everything would come to light. Everyone hoped the questions would be simple and the event would pass without scandal. But Laysan's face made it clear. He had prepared something special for this conference. He had arranged in advance for journalists to ask the most uncomfortable questions possible. It cost him money, even dipping into his own pocket. He answered part of the questions himself, and then all eyes turned to the necromancer. Journalists pressed in from every side, with a redhead from Korea Post pushing hardest, wearing the face of Jake Paul convinced he could fight again. Constant hints that the necromancer had killed his partner left no room to breathe. The Huarang Guild boss clearly wanted to frame his enemy and disgrace him nationwide. What he didn't realize was that the necromancer had survived real hell for many years. To him, this press conference was no scarier than watching a children's fairy tale. He harshly warned the journalist to never spread that kind of nonsense again. Then, ignoring the cameras, the immortal slowly turned toward Laysan. One brutal kick was enough to send that red-haired rat crashing to the floor right in front of the cameras. The hall exploded into screams and chaos. No one had been ready for a press conference ending like this. In that moment, Kang felt as if he were sealed inside a vacuum where no one was watching him at all. For an ordinary person, this would have become a lifelong public disgrace. But for an immortal necromancer, bad PR meant absolutely nothing. On the planet Alphen, he had personally wiped out more than 1 billion monsters. Back there, the entire world watched his every step, so a live broadcast in one country didn't even register. He calmly continued beating Laysan live on air, doing it one-handed. The slaps landed heavy and loud, pure Will Smith at the Oscars energy, minus the applause. Hoon, watching the broadcast on TV, couldn't help remembering himself in a similar position. His boss had never cared about public opinion, and now that truth was undeniable. The broadcast suddenly cut off, and the channel panicked and switched to Animal Geographic. Within minutes, the entire internet was flooded with necromancer memes. In the middle of that madness, Donut noticed something important: news coming out of America. He played the video and saw a so-called holy woman performing the impossible. The whole world was already talking about the miracle, and the views were skyrocketing. Hundreds of people were pouring into American cities just to see it with their own eyes. A girl with an elven vibe calmly studied the beauty of a world beyond the ordinary. Beside her sat a man in a wheelchair who had never walked since childhood. Mr. Smith had lived his life in pain, and today, that nightmare was about to end. One magical touch was enough for muscles and nerves to start working together. Mr. Smith rose to his feet as if a god had gifted him wings. Through tears, he thanked the holy woman named Murdy. She calmly replied that the goddess's grace knew no limits, and a reward awaited all who believed. There were Awaken people with similar abilities, but no one had ever reached this level. Healing the wounded was possible, but helping someone sick from birth was nearly impossible. Representatives of American guilds watched everything closely. Merdi was never left alone. No one knew what to expect from such power. She acted as a messenger of the goddess Arya. After leaving the dungeon, she remained in a drowsy state for a long time until she mastered human language. Goddess Arya was the deity of fertility and foresight in the world of Alphen. Her attendant wielded miraculous healing and could deliver prophecies through revelations. Thanks to her gifts, American guilds advanced at breakneck speed. In return, she asked for only one thing: to create an order of paladins devoted to the goddess. Preparations were already underway, and within days more than 1,000 applications had poured in. If this woman couldn't be stopped, the only option left was cooperation and hoping for her help in saving Earth. Mayor D held the highest rank in history, and only a complete idiot would dare cross her. While Merdi was making the world a better place, the immortal continued spreading chaos. In front of the crowd, he beat an ordinary hunter without changing his expression. Then he turned to the journalist and calmly admitted that he had personally killed Yun-hee. She had tried to stab him in the back, and that was something he never forgave. He made it clear that any traitor would meet the same end. After those words, the journalist fell silent, afraid to make a single sound. The necromancer walked into the corridor without showing a trace of emotion. The killing seemed not to bother him at all, unlike Mr. Chan. It was obvious they were made of different stuff and saw the world through entirely different lenses. Kang wanted only one thing: for his message to be heard by the entire country. People had to understand that he would kill anyone who stood in his way. After this, hardly anyone would dare plot against the Adral Guild, especially since the necromancer knew perfectly well that it was Layson who had tried to have him eliminated. Now that the core problems had been dealt with, it was finally possible to move forward without rushing. Cleaning up the fallout from the failed press conference fell on Mr. Chan, since that was literally his job. That was how it always worked. The boss created chaos, and the vice president patiently cleaned up the mess afterward. Looking at the bigger picture, things weren't actually that bad. Stepping outside, the adventurer suddenly realized that many people genuinely saw him as a hero. The city's residents were able to return home, even though just recently they were convinced the place would be wiped off the map. They carried flowers and thanked him, calling him the man who had saved countless lives. It was one of the most rewarding moments of his entire career. In that instant, he clearly felt that none of it had been pointless, and that this path was worth continuing. From that moment on, his allies never once regretted leaving their old jobs for this new challenge. Things were far less bright for the boss of the Huarang Guild. Waking up after the brutal beating, he struggled for a long time to accept the harsh reality. He had been humiliated live on air, and his organization's reputation was shattered in front of the entire nation. He swore to destroy the necromancer at any cost, ready to use even his political connections. For now, Korea faded into the background as the scene shifted to Manhattan, USA. This was where the headquarters of the Titan Guild stood, home to the Order of Arya. Merdi finished her prayer and learned that her master was waiting to meet her. The only thing that truly concerned her was the creation of the Paladin Order. Too many applications had poured in, and time was needed to choose the best warriors worthy of serving the goddess. According to the prophecy, the Paladin Order was destined to become the main force in the holy war against monsters. A catastrophe like the one that destroyed Alphen could never be allowed to happen again. The holy war to protect two worlds was approaching at terrifying speed, and time to prepare was running out. If the prophecy was true, no guild on Earth would be able to handle it alone. Amid all this tension, some good news finally surfaced. The person Merdi had longed to see had finally been found. The moment she looked at the photograph, she froze, as if an icy arrow had pierced her heart and locked her body in place. She trembled, trying to understand why he had returned to Earth and what had happened to him. It seemed that the ruthless necromancer was the very savior spoken of in the prophecy, and now the fate of the world rested in his hands. A full week passed after the sixth-level dungeon was cleared. Emotions cooled slightly, only to be followed by a court summons for assault. The president of the Huarang Guild filed a lawsuit against the necromancer, demanding $10 million in moral damages. That greedy fool didn't even understand who he was trying to go to war with. Kang had hoped the incident would fade with time, but it was hard to erase something that 50 million people had watched live. The boss was so furious that he decided to personally go to the Huarang Guild. His allies practically held him back, afraid of the consequences. Mr. Chan asked to be trusted with the matter and promised to handle everything. He remained painfully polite, though it was obvious one more push would make him snap. For now, they needed to focus on other priorities and expand the Hunter Squad. Far greater threats loomed ahead than clearing ordinary dungeons. The demonic god had close allies known as the Servants of Trenet. When those creatures reached Earth, fighting Cyclopes would feel like a casual walk on warm Brazilian beaches. Once the necromancer commanded an elite army. Now he had only a scattered bunch of misfits. The only hunter at his disposal was young and inexperienced Sangu. While Chan searched for new recruits, Sangu began a path of serious training. He had to be forged into a real fighter, or he would be useless. The time had come when simply carrying the boss's gear was no longer enough. Real contribution was required. They gathered their equipment and headed into the nearest dungeon. This was where Sangu's journey from loser to berserker truly began. He hadn't even finished the first stage yet, but he was already getting used to the smell of blood. His stats were climbing little by little, a clear sign that he was ready for the next trial. Every ambitious guy carries a goal deep inside, even if he's scared to admit it out loud. If Sangu didn't want to spend his entire life hauling the boss's gear and staying on backup duty, he had to take a real risk. He had always dreamed of becoming a powerful fire mage, but lately that dream had faded into the background. All this time he'd been a driver, hauling dirty equipment, running errands, and booking dungeons. It was time to end that chapter and dump the dirty work on Donut. The perfect candidate. Zero motivation, zero conscience, but loud enough to shake walls. Becoming a great fire mage required character and ironclad willpower. Sangu swore he had both, without fully grasping what kind of hell he'd signed up for. The next month would stay with him forever, because soon it would be clear whether he'd become a legend or die on the training grounds. After several weeks of merciless training, Sangu started cursing the day he ever met his boss. He couldn't understand how ordinary field exercises had quietly turned into a fight for survival. When the boss promised to turn him into an elite hunter, it sounded cool and inspiring. Reality, however, was so brutal and filthy that it felt like a never-ending nightmare. Sangu had long forgotten rest and proper meals. Now he lived on forest mushrooms and trained around the clock. Sometimes he was allowed to sleep on damp ground, only to be thrown into the ocean with sharks without warning. High-level skeletons constantly tested his limits, never giving him even a second to breathe. No matter how painful it was, the training started paying off. His talents bloomed like cherry blossoms after rain. His fire attacks doubled in power, and speed was no longer his weak point. Sangu felt the rush. His eyes burned, and his stare told every enemy that quitting wasn't an option. The problem was that the monsters were growing more dangerous too. The undead never backed down and were harsher than any desperate instructor. That day, Sangu nearly died and screamed so loudly that the entire forest heard him. After that, the necromancer approached and forced him to stand up, teeth clenched against the pain. To survive, one had to become stronger. There was no other path. To fuel his ally, the boss urged Sangu to imagine his future. When Sangu became the greatest mage alive, every door in the world would open for him. Money would stop being an issue, and beautiful women would beg him for dates. The motivation hit too hard. The guy screamed like a pig headed for slaughter. He begged for help to reach the next level and finally bring all his dreams to life. That kind of hunger was exactly how real legends were born. After the most brutal training yet, it was finally time to rest. Sangu earned himself a massive dinner at a local cafe through sheer suffering. He looked like a zombie starved for weeks straight. His wounds had to be healed immediately with a magic potion, or he would have bled out on the spot. On TV, a report was airing about a holy woman saving America. Her unbelievable powers had already helped hundreds across the country. One glance wasn't enough for Kang to recognize her right away. He saw a beautiful woman, but only when he heard the name did it click. If this really was Murdy, then he needed to fly to America fast and arrange a meeting. She was never supposed to be on Earth, and if she was here, something serious had gone down. Without wasting time, the boss headed straight to the guild office to meet the vice president. He demanded immediate tickets to America and for the visa process to be handled. Chan already knew that a summit of the world's strongest hunters would take place in the US in the coming weeks. The strongest people on the planet were gathering to discuss how to fight monsters and protect Earth. Judging by everything, Saint Murdy would be involved and would likely take control of the situation. The immortal couldn't care less about official meetings. He just wanted to see an old friend. Mr. Chan promised to handle everything, but first they had to deal with the Ministry of Defense. An urgent mission came in from them. The local star was requested to head to Pyongyang. Just hearing that city's name was enough to make him forget all plans involving America. A trip to North Korea was the last thing he wanted, but sometimes you have to move against your own desires. The local dictator had pushed everyone past the limit, hated even by those whose job required smiling and clapping on command. Legends of his cruelty circulated everywhere, yet even those stories failed to capture how terrifying Kim Jong-un felt in person. Tears meant nothing to him. He seemed to have despised any kind of acting since childhood. If a soldier failed an order, death followed instantly. No trial, no questions, no mercy. Sometimes he staged public executions himself, just to remind everyone who owned the board. Not long ago, a massive dungeon opened inside the country, and North Korea couldn't handle the threat alone. For the first time in many years, they were forced to contact South Korea and ask for help. One aide reported that they would have to deal with a new hunter superstar. Kim Jong-un had long dreamed of meeting the necromancer in person, and now the chance had arrived. Kang had joked about North Korea more than once, never imagining things would turn this dark. Now he was heading into the country himself to deal with the local dungeon. Lieutenant Chayi would support him on this mission, someone he had already crossed paths with before. At the same time, a delegation of diplomats entered North Korea, hoping to stabilize relations. Before any purge could begin, they had to understand the dictator's motives. Rumors said the country had almost no hunters, and that was close to the truth. Guilds and talent had never been cultivated here, leaving them helpless against a threat like this. North Korea had once leaned heavily on China, but that alliance had recently cracked. China refused to help, forcing the regime to urgently search for new partners. For the profit tied to clearing the dungeon, they were ready to forget principles and work with South Korea. Diplomats would handle the politics, but first the dungeon had to be sealed. For negotiations to succeed, the necromancer had to eliminate the threat completely. A dungeon rupture was unacceptable. Otherwise, relations between the countries would explode again. The situation was razor-thin fragile. One wrong step meant chaos. The lieutenant repeatedly urged the necromancer to be extremely careful. The fate of two nations now rested in his hands, whether he realized it or not. Their first stop was a meeting with the president inside his luxurious palace. Military hardware surrounded the place, clearly meant to intimidate visitors. Inside the palace stood soldiers who didn't talk and barely blinked. Kang was deliberately kept waiting, a display of psychological pressure. He was ready for it. Those tricks didn't work on him. Heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor as the dictator emerged from his lair. He was the first to extend a hand and greet the famous adventurer. From that moment on, Nothing went the way Chayi expected. Seeing the dictator, Kang grimaced. Bloated authority, icy eyes, and the smile of a man who believed himself untouchable. He greeted him like running into a washed-up school drunk from the past. The guards instantly lost it and demanded respect. The necromancer rushed an apology and mixed up the president's name, calling him Kim Dumun. That single slip was enough to derail the meeting instantly. The lieutenant panicked, her entire life flashing before her eyes. She was sure they were about to be executed, especially when soldiers reached for their weapons. Inside her head, one thought screamed on repeat. She had warned him, and he still wrecked everything in 10 seconds flat. Meanwhile, he just smirked, as if standing on the edge of death was business as usual. Instead of rage, the president burst out laughing, appreciating the bold insult. He declared that he respected people brave enough to walk the blade's edge. The dictator took no offense and formally welcomed the guest into his home. After that, they sat at the table and got straight to business. Kang immediately ditched formalities and brought up the dungeon, ignoring diplomacy entirely. Kim Jong-un appreciated the bluntness and confirmed the dungeon threatened the entire country. He promised to grant any request if the hunter cleared it. The necromancer saw no reason to wait and decided to begin the operation that very day. He planned to claim the entire reward for himself, and by doing so, carve a path toward an alliance between the two Koreas. The guy looked locked in and confident, even though he still had no idea what kind of nightmare waited ahead. The dungeon's level was unknown, but every previous squad that entered had been wiped out. Kang rejected military support outright, making it clear he had no intention of dragging kids into his fight. That level of audacity earned respect, even if it seriously annoyed everyone around him. Every single step he took was being watched with obsessive attention. The president was already considering keeping this adventurer in the country as his personal bodyguard. At the same time, he knew the rule. If Kang failed, his head would roll. The moment the immortal stepped into the dungeon, the familiar energy of Tranit crashed down on him. The demonic god's colony reeked with a disgusting stench, like reality itself screaming to be erased. Somewhere in here, one of the 72 commanders could be hiding. Facing a monster like that meant only one thing. Survival belonged to the one who never made a single mistake. First, the path had to be cleared by dealing with the Mantis army. Steady progress allowed Kang to unlock yet another familiar. The giant monster was named Dolso, and he had waited far too long for a chance to break free. To Dolso, the Mantises weren't a fight but a warm-up, crushed like minions from Despicable Me. Within minutes, the monster hordes were reduced to heaps of shredded remains. The Chinese would probably celebrate and somehow figure out how to cook it into something edible. After the Purge, the necromancer summoned an army of skeletons and prepared for round 2. This time, the enemies were different insects, poisonous black widow spiders. On the horizon appeared Rokto, a rhino with absurd strength and near impenetrable defense. A seasoned fighter knew that even beasts like that had weak points. Against such a foe, Dolso should be able to finish the job in minutes. That was how the second round against the demonic god's colony began. When the forces collided, it became obvious only the strongest would survive. The clash between the two titans was especially insane to witness. The boss backed his favorite familiar, activating the bone prison technique. He leapt atop his mount, aiming a strike straight at the rhino's exposed weakness. This new skill was called the brandish technique, aged and lethal like century-old French wine. The next 12 days drowned in blood, shattered bones, and non-stop agony. When it finally ended, the victors uncovered the incubator, the core of the entire colony. After the victory, the necromancer summoned the souls of fallen monsters and bent them to his will once more. Their command was simple: erase the colony and stop the next invasion. It dealt a serious blow to Tranit's army, even though final victory was still far away. Soon the entire colony detonated, as if packed with dynamite from the inside. The necromancer barely managed to take cover before the shockwave hit. When the dust settled, a blinding light ignited ahead. As a reward for clearing the dungeon, he obtained the return stone and a precious dimensional fragment. The dimensional stone turned out to be a mysterious shard from which the material world itself was formed. How to use it wasn't clear yet, but its future role would be decisive. For now, the artifact had to be hidden and shown to no one. While the immortal necromancer was purging the dungeon, the dictator's secret chamber was anything but quiet. Turns out the guy was a hardcore fan of everything related to hunters. He even had a personal collection, generously funded by the national budget. A new portrait now dominated the treasury, and Kang definitely wouldn't be happy about it. The old photograph was tossed out without hesitation. The dictator changed idols easily, discarding former favorites without a shred of regret. At that moment, emergency news arrived. The immortal necromancer had successfully cleared Gwangyong Station. Now the dictator hoped to keep the hunter in his country, smothering him with privileges and attention. But this plan clearly didn't sit well with the commander of the DPRK's elite special unit, a man named Peng Guan. From the very start, he hated the necromancer, seeing him as a symbol of a foreign and hostile culture. That hatred only deepened when the guy cleared the dungeon in 3 days, while the army looks like a nervous jury at a middle school science fair. After his return from the dungeon, all public attention snapped straight onto him. He pulled off the impossible and made the entire world debate not the feat itself, but the man behind it. Talking to foreign reporters never interested him. Kang was built for way bigger things than cheap headlines. Lieutenant Chahier rushed in immediately to congratulate him in person. She was convinced that negotiations between the two countries would now accelerate and the agreement would be signed much faster. Diplomats were already grinding nonstop, and the first results were cautiously labeled as restrained optimism. Inside the team, everyone knew the odds of the clearance succeeding had been over 70% against them, but nobody dared say it out loud. Not wanting to waste free time, the necromancer decided to dive back into a dungeon once again. He didn't stop to think that his death or failure could collapse every deal achieved so far. This guy loved walking the blade's edge, feeding on the risk that reminded him he was still alive. North Korea needed to learn one thing fast. Interfering with his dungeon runs was a bad idea. They clearly weren't used to dungeons being farmed multiple times, stacking profit and growth like a broken system. 2 more brutal weeks in the warped time of another world pushed the necromancer closer to his former greatness. Step by step, he reclaimed his lost strengths, knowing they would soon be desperately needed. Before long, Earth itself would stand on the brink of annihilation, and only this guy would have the power to stop it. During battles, he barely intervened, letting his army handle all the dirty and lethal work. Sometimes boredom kicked in, and that's when he started picking off vulnerable targets himself. His accuracy was flawless as ever, even though he never considered himself a master archer. Warrior-class privileges made him twice as dangerous and unlocked one especially intriguing ability. He could summon a ghost that looked disturbingly similar to himself. For the first time in many years, this skill finally awakened, and the specter stepped out of the shadows again. It excelled at staying unseen and carrying out any order, though it was almost useless in open combat. As a spy, however, it was perfect, feeding the boss information and keeping him one step ahead at all times. By then, the dungeon was finished, and another full clear ended in total success. After returning to the real world, it became clear that negotiations were still ongoing. A visibly shaken Chahier worried about him and practically begged him to stop. If he dove back into another dungeon now, the risk would be insane, with an entire nation's fate on the line. This time, he chose to trust his friend and allowed himself a short rest after the grind. The banquet hall was alive with laughter, the two delegations acting like old friends reunited at a party. To him, it was painfully boring. fake smiles, hollow faces like a graduation party for future middle managers. He signed a few autographs and excused himself with talk of urgent matters. As he left, he felt someone watching him and decided to test an old skill. The necromancer ordered the ghost to shadow the dictator and monitor his every move. It turned out to be a serious mistake because the real threat wasn't Kim Jong-un at all. Captain Guan was the one who would try to burn everything down. He refused to let anyone look down on North Korea and decided the hunter had to be eliminated. One of his subordinates was already ready to step up and play the role of a suicide bomber. A massive load of dynamite would detonate at the press of a trigger, and not even higher powers would save anyone. After such a dull evening, he just wanted to unwind a little. And for a guy like Kang, the best way to relax was another dungeon clear. Two soldiers wished him luck, then stared after him a bit too intently. Their faces seemed to change, darkening instantly, as if shadows swallowed their minds. One of them suddenly broke into a sprint, chasing after the hunter to stop him. The immortal necromancer sensed nothing wrong and calmly listened to the soldier's frantic speech. It turned out the man was ready to press the detonator and sacrifice himself for a so-called greater cause. His only wish was to restore North Korea's greatness, even at the price of an absurd death. The explosion was so violent that the soldier was torn into scraps barely fit to be rat food. An internal barrier absorbed the blast, and outside, no one even realized anything had happened. The captain had kept everything under absolute control from the very beginning and was fully convinced his plan ran clean, flawless, no glitches. He never imagined that the guy already written off as dead had survived, even if he now looked like a walking corpse held together by pure will. The necromancer's life could have ended at any second, and the captain genuinely hoped that would be the final chapter. For several days straight, Kong went completely silent, and with each passing night, his friend's anxiety grew heavier. In the end, she went straight to the South Korean ambassador and asked him to carefully and calmly review the photographs she brought. Foreign reporters had supplied images that looked way too strange, raising far more questions than answers. The photos clearly showed a soldier following the necromancer into the dungeon, a soldier who never came back out. Everything about it smelled wrong, and Chaye demanded an immediate investigation. She was coldly informed that this was Pyongyang, and here no one could be accused without ironclad proof. One wrong word, and you get chopped into pieces and casually fed to pigs. No trial, no questions. The lieutenant was made to understand that interfering was pointless, and all she could do was hope for the best. Naturally, foreign journalists blasted the story across every global tabloid within hours. When the dictator learned he was being suspected of murdering South Korea's biggest star, he flew into real rage. Kim Jong-un ordered everyone involved to be found immediately and vowed to personally deal with the situation. The optics were brutal, with North Korea starting to look openly monstrous in the eyes of the world. For several days, not a single piece of good news appeared, and then suddenly the barrier activated. The moment people heard about it, they realized hope wasn't completely dead yet. The man believed to be dead had survived, and his devilish grin made one thing clear: he was back for revenge. Wounded but unbroken, the necromancer dragged himself forward, leaving a trail of blood behind him. Everyone around froze, holding their breath, waiting to see what he would do next. He made it clear instantly that this was payback time, and everyone responsible for the betrayal would die brutally and publicly. With shaking hands and cold sweat pouring down their faces, soldiers desperately grabbed their weapons. The fools didn't even realize that ordinary bullets couldn't pierce the armor of a man whose survival once decided the fate of the world. The first soldier was erased instantly, looking less like a fight and more like an adult beating a child. After that, Kang knocked out several more soldiers right in front of his favorite familiar. It turned out that among the local forces were also multi-awakened hunters. Their level couldn't be underestimated, since each had devoted their entire life to training. The real question was what they would do once the necromancer unleashed the phantom spear technique. Massive spectral spears erupted from all directions, slicing flesh and tearing souls apart. Their strength meant nothing. Next to this devil, ordinary hunters were pure background noise. When bodies were already piled high, the lieutenant rushed in, trying to stop her friend. She was an Awaken hunter herself, but she refused to intervene with force and tried to stabilize the situation. She explained that killing a neighboring government would plunge the world into total chaos. He calmly made it clear they had been betrayed, and he had no intention of pretending otherwise. If it came to that, he was ready to walk over bodies and never look back. Chaya was doing her duty, standing firm and refusing to retreat. Looking into her eyes, he understood clearly that there would be no agreement, and he would have to follow his own conscience. The lieutenant even seemed relieved, clearly not fully grasping what kind of man stood before her. He stepped forward decisively and struck her straight in the chest. For several seconds she was paralyzed, unable to breathe, collapsing face first onto the floor while desperately gasping for air. He had no intention of killing her, only giving her a brief time out to rethink her choices. After that, the real slaughter began, because North Korea was always prepared for scenarios like this. The soldiers quickly grasped the scale of the threat and attacked the hunter from multiple directions. Wrapped in phantom armor, he advanced calmly, erasing everything in his path without hesitation. The route to the main bunker took only minutes, and now it was time for dessert. If they believed titanium doors would save them, they were gravely mistaken. Terrified soldiers tried to reassure the dictator, repeating that the bunker could withstand even a nuclear warhead. It was obvious they didn't believe their own words and had no idea what to do next. The massive doors were absorbed and became part of a gigantic familiar. At that point, it was crystal clear that only a miracle could save the dictator and his inner circle. Kang slaughtered every single one of them, not bothering to listen to pleas for mercy or hollow excuses. The only one left alive was the president, the man Kang considered the root cause of everything that went wrong. It was already too late to beg for forgiveness. The Shadow Wraith was ready to drag the dictator's soul straight into hell. Before carrying out the execution, Kang ordered his servant to reveal all of the president's memories, making sure the judgment was fair. As he watched the events of the past few days unfold, a cold and deeply unsettling shock ran through the necromancer. It turned out Kim Jong-un had no part in the conspiracy and was nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. Now the mess had to be cleaned up, without turning it into an even bigger disaster through a pointless execution. The president swore to hunt down everyone responsible and punish them with maximum cruelty. That was enough to establish a temporary truce and attempt to bury what had happened. Still, no matter how satisfied the president was, the mountains of corpses had to be hidden from the public eye. It became clear that Kim Jong-un was such a hardcore fan of the necromancer that he was ready to forgive him absolutely anything. His private museum made it obvious. When it came to the Awakened, he would sacrifice even his own life without hesitation. When it was over, the necromancer calmly stepped into the corridor and heard the angry growl of a panther. He prepared for a fight, only to realize it was just an ordinary feminist reacting to the phrase about men being in charge. Chaye had been unconscious the whole time and had no idea what actually happened there. She was convinced the dictator was dead and that an international scandal was now unavoidable. Even the news that he was alive didn't calm her right away. She was sure the necromancer was about to kill the president and that nothing could stop him anymore. When everything was finally explained to her, she felt a strange, almost frightening sense of relief for the first time in her life. Her expressions and emotions made it clear. She truly knew nothing about the conspiracy and had acted in good faith. Looking back from the moment they met, there wasn't a single thing to blame Chahi for. For the first time, Kang had met someone with principles so solid they couldn't be ignored. People that valuable were worth pulling to his side at any cost. Kang offered her a massive salary and suggested quitting a military career that only brought trouble. It was time to truly shape the world, not just carry out someone else's dirty orders. While the lieutenant was still thinking it over, the dictator had already found everyone involved and dealt with them. Some innocent people were executed as well, but no one cared enough to sort that out. Every aide of Captain Guan was eliminated, along with the mastermind of the conspiracy himself. Before their deaths, they were accused of robbing the National Hunter Museum, even though the main character took everything himself. The dictator refused to hear objections and made it clear no one was allowed to slander his idol. That was how it all ended, even though just recently catastrophe had seemed inevitable. For the necromancer, the trip was a win. His level climbed, his inventory grew, and his team expanded. The next stop was the United States, where he would quickly realize that demons were dangerous, but taxes looked even scarier. Saint Merdi was a critical piece of the puzzle. Without her, the planet couldn't be saved and balance couldn't be restored. In the following days, everyone discussed what happened in North Korea, and burying the incident proved impossible. Too many foreign journalists had already told the world everything. Awakened individuals were now seen differently. On one side, saviors of the world willing to sacrifice themselves. On the other, beings no one could stop if they chose to break the rules. Still, Kang was labeled a hero, because without him, the country would have faced a full-scale coup. Every member of his team followed the situation closely, glued to the news. At first, the Adral Guild staff watched with disbelief, convinced it was all media exaggeration and cheap hysteria. Donut was the first to defend the boss, insisting he couldn't have coldly murdered soldiers or staged a blood-soaked circus. But the longer the broadcast went on and the more facts surfaced, the more doubt crept in, especially under pressure from friends. Those people had long known what their boss really was and barely questioned who looted the entire North Korean National Museum. Sangu was visibly tense, replaying their first meeting in his head over and over, clinging to every detail. He admitted that even back then he felt it. This man could be cunning and ruthless if the goal demanded it. To him, it was obvious that anyone who stood in Kang's way would lose their head without hesitation. After those words, a heavy silence filled the room, thick and uncomfortable, like the calm before disaster. At that exact moment, the guild doors opened and the boss calmly walked inside. He swept his gaze across everyone and instantly knew the conversations behind his back had just ended. Of course, they instantly pretended they had been discussing some other South Korean hunter, random and completely irrelevant. To ease the tension and wash away the aftertaste of recent chaos, Kang suggested hitting a local restaurant. Guild members almost never spent time together outside work, without orders, reports, and constant pressure. Now they could finally relax, drop the formal masks, breathe out, and allow themselves to rest. Fresh sushi and ice-cold sake could lift the mood of even the dead. Field-tested, way more effective than any Dr. House therapy session. After everything that happened, Kang kept getting summoned to meetings with the local president, but he felt zero interest. Mr. Chan was supposed to handle that himself. After all, that was exactly what the big paycheck was for. Ignoring the president's calls felt awkward, but for a member of the Adral Guild, Kang mattered more than any head of state. When the group was already pretty drunk, Donut suddenly brought up something that had been eating at him for a long time. A holy woman had appeared in America, someone who could heal people with a single touch. The boss reacted calmly, casually mentioning that he had known her personally for a long time. Everyone froze in shock. Kang had never been to America, so how could he possibly know her? He had been working with them for months and decided there was no point hiding the truth anymore. The necromancer openly admitted that he had survived for many years on another planet called Alphen. That was where the monsters now creeping into Earth came from, which explained why he knew their weaknesses so well. At first no one believed him, assuming the boss was drunk and rambling like a Pokemon fan convinced Pikachu exists. He had to make it clear that this was no joke and that every word needed to be taken dead serious. The time spent on Alpha never left his mind. Every battle and every drop of blood stayed with him. 20 years had felt like an eternity, and now everyone understood why the boss had become so ruthless and straightforward. Now he was heading to America to meet an old acquaintance. It sounded nice, though in reality their relationship could hardly be called friendship in the usual sense. That very morning, Saint Merdi received a prophecy directly from the goddess. She learned that the immortal necromancer was approaching, and her hands began to tremble on their own. Memories from 5 years ago, tied to the planet Alphen, surged through her mind. Back then, the situation was razor tight. Survival demanded constant sacrifices of principles. Saint Merdi and her companions moved through rocky mountains, scanning every ledge with extreme caution. Everyone was on edge, silently hoping the expedition wouldn't end in disaster. Only a madman would walk through the Valley of Death, a place no one had ever returned from alive. But that day, it was the only path to survival and the only way to protect their homeworld. If the travelers slowed down even for a second, they would be caught by the demon god or the immortal necromancer. They feared him for real, and it showed the moment his figure appeared on the horizon. Panic erupted, people not even having time to reach for their weapons. St. Merdi's closest aide lost his head before he could even think about sharing his crypto wallet password. The saint screamed like a slaughtered pig, and then she finally saw him. Under the moonlight, the man shone like a diamond pulled from the ancient depths of a mountain. His merciless grin made it clear. Today would go exactly the way he wanted. The necromancer seemed not to remember that moment at all, calmly calling Merdi his friend. While she waited tensely for the meeting, he and his allies had already gotten seriously drunk. In fact, Donut overdid it the most and ended up passed out right at the table. That pig had never known restraint, unlike his more composed companions. Fueled by liquid courage, the group finally decided to speak up and share what had been bothering them. They couldn't understand why the boss was so harsh with journalists and kept painting himself as the villain. They tried to explain that stacking up new enemies was a bad strategy and something he should drop fast. Kang used to be different. He cared about the country and tried to keep balance and stability. But now he was on Earth, and the old approach no longer worked. One single word, catastrophe, was enough to make everything else fade into the background. Soon the moment would come when all dungeons would turn into rifts and explode at once. This couldn't be compared to the problems from 5 years ago, when the world had only begun to change. A dungeon would appear at such a level that no hunter could possibly clear it. Hunters and soldiers would look like a pack of dogs suddenly ambushed by tigers. And then, if everything spirals out of control, dragons will descend, torching every living thing in their path. Only the strongest will survive. Those who can unite not for ideals, but for raw, selfish ambition. Compared to that kind of apocalypse, even nuclear war would look like a generous gift from the heavens. Of course, there will be stubborn fools who refuse to give up, clinging to justice until the very end. Wars, kings, saints, and their knights will become the foundation of a new, brutally unforgiving world. But in the end, civilization will still collapse, and only those who adapt fast will remain standing. To prevent that future, humanity will need a hero right in the middle of the catastrophe. They will need someone who doesn't care about rules because he stands far above the system itself. That is exactly why reacting to newspaper insults, court summons, and bad press makes no sense right now. On the contrary, Kang plans to show even harder just how arrogant and merciless he can be when the moment comes. His strategy is crystal clear, which means it's time to see what his main enemy thinks about all this. Lei San was already sick of reading headlines calling the necromancer the strongest fighter in the world. Once he had underestimated that guy, and now his familiar world was crumbling into pieces. It hurt to watch himself lose everything while the immortal bloomed like spring flowers in full swing. He lost his sister, and the guild lost its respect and state support. To deal with the pile of problems, he decided to pull out a hidden ace from his sleeve. The president of the Huarang Guild entered a PIN code and opened a safe filled with classified documents. Photos of those files were sent to an old and extremely influential acquaintance. Almost instantly, the phone rang, belonging to someone whose reach was hard to even imagine. To keep those documents from going public, the businessman was ready to do absolutely anything. Laysan asked for only one thing, promising in return to destroy the compromat forever. Kang felt that a knife in the back could come at any moment, even if he didn't know exactly when. So he calmly packed his things and within a week was preparing to fly to America. If Sangu had managed to level up a bit more, he would have gone with the boss. Even so, he was happy. His level had risen, and a brand new B-rank ID card was now in his hands. To congratulate his student, the boss decided to gift him a precious return core. Those cores only drop in serious dungeons, making it the best gift of Sangu's life. Right before departure, urgent and extremely unpleasant news arrived. Rumors spread that terrorists were planning something horrific, and all flights were temporarily grounded. They had to wait, and today's trip to the States would most likely be canceled. Sometimes it's random events that lead to the most unexpected encounters. A loud, confident male voice rang out, belonging to someone who clearly knew what he wanted. He had heard stories about the necromancer from the Soul Station and dreamed of meeting him in person. One confident look was enough to show his interest in Kang. Kang saw the old man for the first time and had no idea who he was. He looked like an NPC ready to hand out a quest. In reality, this was the head of a massive guild and real estate corporation known as KH Group. Only a few people knew that Baek Chando was also a high-level hunter. He offered to fly to America on his private jet, brushing off all delays like they didn't exist. For Kang, it was a golden ticket he couldn't possibly refuse. Then Baek made a strange gesture and unexpectedly suggested they become friends. Honestly, Kang didn't fully get what that even meant. He clearly hadn't been keeping up with TV trends. If he had watched Squid Game, he would have understood instantly, but it's never too late to catch up. During the flight, they decided to watch the first season and make the necromancer at least a little more modern. After a 20-hour flight, the private jet finally landed in the land of free America. The experienced hunter and successful businessman turned out to be a genuinely useful ally. He showed Kang several seasons of Squid Game, and now they constantly joked using references from the show. Their assistants pretended not to know these people and blushed with secondhand embarrassment every time. At the airport, they were greeted by a representative of the Titan Guild, assigned to escort the guests. They had to part ways with their new friend, but it clearly wasn't a final goodbye. It felt like they clicked perfectly, and sooner or later, fate would definitely bring them together again. Now he could fully focus on American business and finally get at least a little serious. The real reason why Baek had taken such a strong interest in the necromancer was still not entirely clear. He clearly liked the guy's arrogance and already saw him as a potential partner. On top of that, their taste in TV shows matched, which, strangely enough, turned out to matter more than many contracts. After such a long flight, serious business talks were off the table anyway. Reaching a decent hotel at last, the necromancer finally got a chance to properly rest. He had no intention of sleeping right away and suggested having a drink to fully unwind. Mr. Chan, who had dreamed of sinking into a jacuzzi and enjoying silence, was visibly disappointed. In the end, they agreed to meet downstairs after everyone finished their bath routines. The necromancer washed up, got dressed, and suddenly noticed a strange narrow beam of light cutting through the dark room. At first, he thought it was some dumb prank, but then he remembered what kind of brutal world he lived in. A thin laser meant only one thing. Someone had already locked on, and there was no time left to think. To prevent the deaths of countless people, the immortal lunged forward and chose to strike first. He didn't care about the consequences, knowing that his barrier and monstrous strength almost guaranteed survival. Everyone below witnessed a massive explosion that lit up half the city like a second sunrise. After the blinding flash came a dull impact, as if a body had smashed straight into the ground. It was the necromancer from South Korea, alive, but having landed right on someone else's car. The ghostly armor burned through all stored souls, but it saved his life. He immediately downed a magic potion, rapidly restoring his strength and physical resources. The whole situation felt off. Terrorists rarely strike without reason and almost never target a regular hotel. Most likely, there was only one objective: kill him specifically. Now the ghost would trail the terrorists and gather all the necessary intel. After that, Kang would come for them personally, and his revenge would hit harder than a devil's kiss. That same evening, Saint Murdy was informed that the necromancer had arrived in America. She grew visibly nervous, repeatedly reassuring herself that no one would manage to anger him. It was strange to see someone so powerful gripped by such intense fear. Her lips trembled, her mouth went dry, like after hours under a scorching sun. And all because tomorrow she would face the immortal feared by an entire planet. To establish dialogue, she was ready to go to him first herself. Merdi tried to find out which hotel Kang was staying in so she could head there immediately. That required serious escort from high-level fighters. The Holy Knights of Aria, also known as Paladins, were ready to fulfill their duty. The chief paladin, Officer James Barnes, promised to deliver Murdy to the hotel safe and sound. When Mr. Chan heard the explosion, panic hit him and he tried to contact the boss. Dark thoughts spiraled in his head, and he quickly realized the necromancer might have been the target. Just 5 minutes earlier, he had been standing under a warm shower, thinking about pleasant little things. Hearing the blast, he first assumed it was just a gas tank explosion, but stepping onto the balcony made it clear. It was a terrorist attack. Breaking into the boss's room, he froze in horror, as if staring straight into something truly terrifying. By that time, elite paladins were already escorting Saint Murdy toward the hotel. She felt uneasy, clearly shaken, unable to sit still for even a moment. She usually behaved very differently, and her anxiety spread even to her closest guard. He swore to protect the saint at any cost. She had recently cured his daughter of a terminal illness. The car slammed to a sudden stop, and only seatbelts saved the passengers from impact. The driver apologized and reported a strange explosion ahead. While people on the streets feared a repeat of a terrorist attack from 20 years ago, Murdy was thinking about something else entirely. She feared these events would enrage the necromancer, and then all of America would drown in chaos. She ordered them to keep moving and not even think about turning back. Meanwhile, Kang was already trying to intercept one of the terrorists. The ghost was chasing a helicopter, but that was only one of several targets. The man who had guided the strike with a laser was now calmly strolling through a dark alley between buildings. He moved quietly, steadily, and with confidence, fully convinced that nothing could touch him right now. That confidence was a lie, because death was already walking right behind him, completely silent. At one point, he suddenly bolted forward like he'd heard a fresh Taylor Swift track and realized running was the only option left. A real chase began, where every meter, every turn, every inch could decide the outcome. The criminal had exposed himself, and now there was no doubt left. He had to be erased. His overconfidence mirrored Yunhee's, who had believed to the very end that she could defeat the necromancer. Kang activated a dash skill and accelerated in an instant, as if the space ahead of him had compressed. He nearly caught up, already reaching out, when the target simply vanished in the next heartbeat. It was a high-level ability that allowed instant repositioning, breaking pursuit in one move. The terrorist was called Al-Assad, and even without a smile he kept mocking the immortal. He raised 2 fingers and beckoned in open provocation, as if inviting Kang to keep playing. Then the criminal calmly entered the nearest subway station, deliberately avoiding unnecessary witnesses. More than 10 years had passed since anyone dared mock the necromancer this openly. If this man wanted to play grown-up games, the immortal was more than happy to accept. The subway was dark, damp, and hostile, like ghosts of the past endlessly wandering the tunnels. Al-Assad had no doubt the arrogant Korean was walking straight toward his own grave. For the terrorist, this was familiar hunting ground, a craft he'd learned back when he was just a teenager in Afghanistan. His father had sold his own son to insurgents for a few dollars just to buy food. That act shattered the child and turned him into a sociopath, incapable of normal human connection. To put it bluntly, he became a monster who could kill with his eyes closed. Endless war burned into his mind, forcing him to kill just to survive. Now he could wipe out even an entire army without hesitation if the order came. Killing, killing, and more killing. That was all his conscious life had ever been. His very existence was built on doing that filthy, blood-soaked work. After awakening, he began taking elite contracts to assassinate politicians and military generals. Clutching a dagger, he waited calmly and coldly for the moment to end another life. Kang moved through the tunnels as if he could see straight through the darkness and predict every step ahead. His heartbeat stayed steady and calm even when the killer appeared right behind him. A flash of light made it instantly clear this fight would be neither quick nor easy. Kang blocked Al-Assad's strike, proving that tonight he faced a truly worthy opponent. Each of them had walked their own brutal path, but only one would leave this place alive. For someone who had survived a demonic world, an ordinary terrorist still didn't feel impossible. Al-Assad refused to be a pawn in a Grandmaster's game and immediately struck back. He moved like a wounded dog backed into a corner, dangerous, desperate, lethal. His skills couldn't be underestimated. He had long reached an elite level. After awakening his abilities, no one could predict his actions until he crossed paths with the immortal. Thanks to overwhelming combat experience, Kang saw every move before it even began. He didn't even need to summon the dead. In the subway's darkness, he was in his element. The ability to vanish into shadows made the necromancer nearly unbeatable in conditions like these. The terrorist began searching and quickly stumbled upon a pool of fresh blood. Silence ruled the area, making it impossible to tell where that blood had come from. A sudden blinding flash lit up the space, revealing the necromancer and his elite squad of skeletons. Thus began the second round, the final, decisive clash of titans. The fool had been carefully lured into a trap, even while imagining himself the predator. In reality, he was the prey, about to be cut into tiny pieces. To avoid becoming a pawn, one must risk everything, and Al-Assad had learned that rule as a child. After awakening his powers, he unlocked the technique of divine wrath. Once activated, the assassin transformed into a berserker with assassin-level skills. Now he was ready to challenge even the devil himself, let alone a bunch of ordinary skeletons. The assassin carved through skeletons without the slightest hesitation, leaving behind not a fight but a literal mountain of bones. His gaze turned cloudy, as if his mind had drowned completely in a murky river of madness and rage. That was exactly what the necromancer wanted, because nothing hits better than a proper slaughter before bedtime. When the assassin closed into arm's length, he was already convinced it was over. The opponent clearly couldn't keep up, and all that remained was a careless swing to take the head. A sinister grin crept across Al-Assad's face. He was sure his 100th hunt had ended in success. Al-Assad swung, and the world suddenly jolted as Kang's blade slid across his neck before the killer could even blink. The arrogant assassin's head flew from his shoulders, and his heart stopped faster than thought itself. That is how every attempt to cross an immortal necromancer ends. Kang chose to activate the very skill known as the Soul Seal. This technique allowed him to bind the soul of a defeated enemy and use it whenever the moment demanded. After the battle, Kang went to claim his well-earned rest, and the very next day headed to the interview hall of the Titan Guild. This was where the long-awaited council of the world's strongest guilds was set to take place. Mr. Bike was already there, riding high after a Breaking Bad marathon, as if he'd decided villainy counted as career growth. This TV series addict was starting to irritate Mr. Chan, who still couldn't shake yesterday's incident from his mind. He worried America might see Kang as a terrorist staging a public attack. On top of that, the boss still hadn't arrived, meaning the meeting would start without him. Representatives from guilds across the globe had gathered inside, but the hall fell silent when Mr. Dean stepped up to the microphone. He immediately stated that facing the coming catastrophe would require more than a single guild. Spatial gates would soon unleash hordes of deranged monsters hungry to devour Earth. All of these creatures once lived on the planet Alphen, which had now become uninhabitable. Time flows differently on Alphen. A single Earth year equals only a few months there. Representatives of the Japanese Taken Guild, profiting from bloodstone trade, hesitated over closing the portals. Their concern was profit, not how catastrophic the consequences might become. Mr. Dean proposed a solution involving the participation of Saint Merdi. According to his plan, humans from Earth would cross the bridge first and begin exterminating monsters preemptively. Silence filled the hall, followed by a low rumble of muted debates and arguments. Everyone knew Saint Merdi possessed extraordinary power, but trust remained the real issue. She claimed she had come from Alphen to help, yet too much about it felt suspicious. To prove her superiority, she flooded the hall with monstrous energy and amplified every hunter present. There was not a single human in the world capable of something like that. Together with the Paladin Order, the Saint intended to open a portal and let humans enter the demonic world. If they refused, Earth would repeat Alphen's fate and sink into chaos. To save both planets, war would have to begin, even if many hated the idea. On top of that, saving Earth would allow bloodstone trade to continue, killing two birds with one move. At that moment, a familiar voice cut in, reminding everyone that the portal to Alphen was already open. The instant she saw him, Saint Merdi forgot about destiny itself. Standing in the doorway was the immortal necromancer, and now he was the one setting the terms. Tension snapped through the room, and Saint Merdi trembled as if she were staring at her own death. The hall froze as Merdi looked at him like he wasn't a man but a verdict, the past clawing back at her throat. A paladin immediately branded Kang a rude bastard who needed to be taught manners. What followed defied explanation. It was that unreal. Mouths fell open in shock, and the paladin practically swallowed his tongue. You don't see a saint drop to her knees every day. Paladins stood frozen, like fans realizing their idol was fake. That was how one should behave in front of this man, unless they wanted to lose their head like Al-Assad. James Barnes finally understood that even saints were nothing compared to the Lord of the Dead. Merdi hurried to apologize for everything that had happened on Alphen, admitting how much she hadn't known. Now it was time to find out why she had come to Earth and what exactly she was prepared to offer. Merdi had received a direct order from the goddess to bring Earth's savior back to their home planet. There were far too many people around, and the tension could be felt crawling under the skin. Kang wanted to talk calmly, as if he didn't even notice that a global live broadcast was rolling right now. People were asked to step back, leaving only a single camera and a clean live feed. On top of that, the hero who had stopped a missile strike on a hotel deserved center stage. Audiences eat that up. Kang decided to use the moment and make a separate announcement aimed straight at the terrorists. He stared directly into the lens and made it clear that whoever fired that missile at him would pay a brutal price. Kang would find everyone involved, and each of them would pay in a way the rest of the world would never forget. The message landed hard, and the people in the hall felt genuine unease crawl up their spines. Mr. Chan finally saw his boss and confirmed that he was truly unharmed. He wanted to thank him for saving the hotel since he'd been in the next room when the explosion hit. But his closest friend was more disturbed by something else. Why Kang kept calling Mirdi his friend and why she had been kissing his feet. Apparently, this guy had his own definition of friendship, and to him, it all felt perfectly normal. The official gathering wrapped up because it was time to discuss the real details of the future plan. In a separate room, the most influential people on the planet gathered, those whose decisions would shape humanity's fate. The necromancer tried to ease the tension, casually saying there was nothing to worry about since he and Mirdi were already friends. She clearly didn't like that wording, as bloody memories from the past flashed before her eyes again. To speed things up, the immortal decided to demonstrate something very clearly. Kang placed the severed head of the terrorist on the table, and the room went so silent that someone swallowing could be heard. The man who had planned the assassination attempt on the Adral monarch was no longer a threat. Kang immediately made it clear he didn't suspect the Titan Guild, since the source of the problem was obviously elsewhere. Saint Mirdi instantly offered her help and promised to personally deal with every terrorist involved. She shot a sharp look at Mr. Dean and demanded that all available resources be used to hunt them down. After that, the discussion shifted to the invasion and the very plan that involved marching into Alphen. The main figure was skeptical. If all the strongest hunters left for another planet, Earth would be left defenseless. To him, it looked like a straight-up declaration of war, and he shut the idea down on the spot. Trying to apologize, the saint dropped to her knees again, apparently forgetting that on Earth it's usually enough to just say, sorry. She chose to present her version of events and began explaining spatial dimensions. While she flooded the room with heavy terms barely anyone understood, something strange was happening at a classified underground base. The ghost had been tracking the terrorists all this time, and the trail led straight there. Some unhinged professor had gathered these people to create a new type of nuclear weapon. The ghost called in Bibi to help gather as much information as possible. The shady research facility turned out to be far more complex than expected, especially after one artifact appeared. An assistant brought the professor a large box, guarded with excessive zeal. The professor set it on the table, unlocked it, and pulled out a glowing yellow stone. The necromancer had received an identical fragment after clearing the dungeon with Tranit's colony. This artifact was called a space fragment, and the professor was convinced it would let him create a new class of nuclear weapon. All his life, he had dreamed of surpassing Dr. Toppler and becoming the greatest scientist on the planet. Readings began to spike rapidly, and the system slowly slipped out of control. At that moment, little Bibi tensed up, sensing that something bad was about to happen. People lost control of the economy as quickly as Jake Paul did when he went out to fight Anthony Joshua. The system completely collapsed, and only the smartest ones started running for safety. But it was already too late. The space fragment activated in a completely unexpected way. It opened a portal to another world and instantly wiped out every scientist in the lab. After that, a monstrous creature emerged, carrying the stench of death itself. Bibi recognized him instantly and hissed like a wild cat at the sight of the neighbor's dog. Standing before her was a succubus radiating terrifying power, one of Tranit's top generals. But for now, let's not reveal what happened next and calmly return to the Titan Guild. Negotiations continued, and the air was thick with overloaded terminology. People had long realized that dungeons were essentially front doors into the world of Alphen. No monster can unleash its full power on Earth without mana. That's why the demonic god first sends weak creatures to Earth, slowly flooding the world with mana crystals. All of this served a single purpose: to turn Earth, step by step, into a perfect, comfortable, fully livable habitat for monsters. The real question now was different: how to stop this process before the planet completely became someone else's home. Dungeons and every spatial dimension were under the direct control of the Lord of Dimensions. In simple terms, he alone decided whether monsters would be sent into this world or left it untouched. The World Invader and his 72 warlords had held that control for years, never loosening their grip. Now they were expanding through war, methodically conquering new lands and dimensions. The warriors of Alphen had failed to put up a real fight and proved too weak, which is why their world was ultimately destroyed. Saint Merdi's plan was to seize the title of Lord of Dimensions and confront Traîné on equal footing. That would allow the dungeons in both worlds to be restored and the situation at least temporarily stabilized. The necromancer was intrigued, instantly picturing himself stripping enemies of their lands and leaving former rulers broke and helpless. But the hardest part came next, figuring out how to claim the dimensional territories and the title itself. The plan required special stones known as space fragments. Kang immediately revealed that he already possessed one such fragment, though it was clearly not enough. There had to be 3 fragments in total, or the entire scheme would collapse. The immortal instantly realized that Saint Merdi could not have come here empty-handed. He read her like an open book, even though she hadn't hinted at the artifact once. One glance was enough to tell. The second fragment was on her right now. Merdi handed over the stone without hesitation, but even 2 fragments were still not enough. The third remained missing, and at that moment the ghost returned, having completed its mission. It brought bad news. The hallucination witch named Bibi had been lost. From all the details, it became clear that one of the demonic god servants had descended to Earth, a succubus named Rashmod. Negotiations stopped instantly because Bibi urgently needed help. Hearing Rashmod's name, Saint Merdi immediately forgot every previous conflict and argument. That demon had to be destroyed immediately, or every human plan would fall apart. The ghost quickly displayed the enemy's exact location, and the delegation moved out at once. Half the hunters and the guild leaders stayed behind. Kang personally ordered them not to interfere. Even Saint Merdi was denied permission to fight at his side. It seemed the immortal was aiming for a personal rematch, and for him, this was a matter of honor. Entering the research zone, he immediately spotted a portal leading straight into a dungeon. Standing beside it was an old acquaintance, the disgusting, foul-smelling Rashmod, holding a black cat in his arms. This slime bag had died more than once at the necromancer's hands, making it a mystery whether he'd somehow forgotten that fact. If the demon had developed dementia, then it was time for some aggressive therapy with a sharp blade. Rashmod knew this meeting was inevitable and hoped things would go differently this time. Back on Alphen, Kang possessed monstrous power and abilities bordering on absolute. After returning, he'd lost most of those skills, and the coming battle promised to be very different. Rashmod had invited him to a dance beneath the earth, warning in advance that the immortal must come alone. Everyone else had to be evacuated far away so no one else would get caught in the blast. There was little time before the clash to issue final orders to his allies. When Kang admitted he no longer held his former power, Saint Merdi went pale, as if struck in the chest. She had expected the immortal to be Earth's savior, and for that, he needed to reclaim all his old strength. In his current state, he could no longer summon the familiars that had made him a legend in another world. Like this, he might not even defeat Rashmod, let alone the demonic god himself. Despite everything, Kang never lost confidence and allowed himself no doubt. He calmly stated that everything would go according to plan. He only needed time and one discovered weak point. When he stepped toward the portal, lightning tore through the sky, as if Zeus had just realized his Apple TV subscription expired. Witnessing this, people instantly lost their nerve and froze in place. Massive monsters began pouring out of the portal, making it clear a dungeon split had occurred. Rashmod had calculated the future battle in advance and acted like a seasoned strategist. He didn't want to supply the necromancer with bodies inside the dungeon, so he released every monster outside ahead of time. That way, humanity gained new problems, and Kang was left without his usual advantage. To truly back up his allies, it was time to unleash a special weapon reserved strictly for the endgame. The Immortal activated the core, and it immediately began devouring every piece of military hardware in the area, leaving not a single gram of metal behind. It looked like Magneto waking up after hearing about yet another X-Men reboot, only angrier, meaner, and on a whole different scale. From the harvested metal, a brand new Optimus Prime took shape, ready to cleanse this world of every last Decepticon wannabe. The monsters clearly hadn't signed up for this. They were promised a fight against ordinary, helpless humans. The Transformer charged forward, crushing them into foul-smelling paste, turning writhing vermin into molten scrap. At that exact moment, Saint Merdi finally realized the truth. The Immortal hadn't lost his power. He was still dangerously lethal. Once Kang sealed off the surface chaos, he immediately headed toward his meeting with the succubus. Rashmod was clearly dragging him into a pre-built trap, but there was simply no other path forward. Kang couldn't abandon the hallucination witch and was ready to do whatever it took to pull her out alive. Arrogance always overflowed from him, and maybe that was why he and Rashmod were mirrors of each other. Both believed they were the best in existence, but there could only be one crown, and someone had to die. To crank the enemy's rage to maximum, Kang decided to open the fight with a theatrical execution. With a sharp motion, he tore off BB's head, as if completely unaware the animal rights crowd would lose their minds. Still, nothing about it was permanent. Bringing the hallucination witch back from the dead was always an option. The demon would pay for his sins regardless, even if he'd prepared something special in advance. The Immortal drew his weapon just in time and cleanly blocked the first strike. He counterattacked immediately, making it clear that years hadn't dulled his edge. A keen observer would have noticed even demons starting to doubt themselves when facing a wall they couldn't break. For Rashmod, this was unthinkable, something he clearly hadn't planned for. The one who was supposed to fall to the opening blow only grew stronger, ready to purge the world of evil. The first counterstrike alone made the demon feel vulnerable for the very first time. Pressing the advantage, Kang began chaining weapons together, constantly shifting style and pressure. The next blow was so brutal that neither barrier nor defense held, slamming the demon straight into the wall. Internal organs clenched in agony as blood poured straight from his mouth. Kang didn't slow down, lunging forward to split the demon in half with a single sword swing. There's always something satisfying about watching a monster who overestimated himself shrink into a terrified child. The strike landed perfectly, the blade slicing through demonic flesh in an instant. The Immortal couldn't understand why Rashmod charged back in if he hadn't grown any stronger since their last encounter. Just as Kang turned to leave, he heard that the demon was still alive, something that felt impossible. By some miracle, Rashmod regenerated his wounds and rose again, like a wannabe necromancer. It seemed he'd implanted another treasure into his body, granting regeneration straight out of a Wolverine fanfic. Thus began the second round, and for it, the demon summoned monsters straight from the abyss. His grin made it obvious. The first round had only been a skill check. Now it was time for max focus and speed, like Rick Sanchez flipping on hardcore mode and going out for beer. To fend off monster swarms while keeping his eye on the real target, Kang had to push himself to the absolute limit. For now, the scene shifts back to the surface, to see how the Transformer was holding up. People watched the battle like a stream with donations turned off, ordering Pizza Hut and pretending everything was fine. Merdi was visibly tense, staring through the monsters as if she could see beyond them. Every thought she had was fixed on the Immortal fighting, the strongest enemy of his entire Earth career. Only minutes passed before the hero was practically drowning in enemy blood. He wiped out nearly every monster, but the cost was painfully high. His strength was running dry, while his opponent kept openly mocking him. This was the moment where the dead summoning technique, the one that made Kang a legend in the Alphan Abyss, became unavoidable. Every fallen soul rose again to answer the call of the strongest necromancer. The skeletons obeyed with delight, closing in on the demonic spawn from all sides. That was when Rashmad finally lost all composure and snapped. As the dead and the monsters tore into each other, the two true titans found their opening to clash once more. Their blades met at the dungeon's center, and even the walls trembled from the impact. Now it was Rashmad's turn to show what he'd become, and how far his twisted evolution had gone. The demonic god had been secretly boosting Rashmad all this time, shaping his talents in the shadows, and by now, the results were genuinely terrifying. At that razor-thin moment, the system dropped a notification that Rocky had secured an overwhelming victory. That meant only one thing. The full energy harvested by the familiar in battle was now flowing straight into its master. The strongest strike activated, and the Anubis technique landed perfectly, the hammer falling with zero margin for error. The demon twisted in agony as the sound of his skull cracking echoed under the weight of the heavy blow. If that somehow wasn't enough, Kang could always switch to a sharp blade and cut away whatever remained. As a kid, he once dreamed of becoming a chef, and now he sliced with the confidence of someone who trained on Mortal Kombat meat his whole life. The decapitated monster finally went silent, and in that dead stillness the scent of victory hung thick in the air. To make sure the demon would never regenerate, Kang crushed the head completely and shut the bastard up for good. This was real victory at last, or at least that's what he was absolutely sure of. After everything was over, the necromancer returned to the surface and immediately congratulated his familiar. Together they had done flawless work, wiping out an entire monster army without even a hint of mercy. Bibi would be fine. As a summoned familiar, she could be restored a month after death. Now it was time for a serious talk, because ignoring what happened today was no longer an option. Rashmad's appearance outside the metro station had a clear cause, and Saint Merdi understood it perfectly. She explained that Earth hadn't fully synchronized yet, which meant dungeons could manifest literally anywhere. Most likely, someone had used a summoning circle to deliberately drag the demon into this world. Only a complete maniac would attempt that, since it was basically signing their own death sentence. Looking at the burned-out station and the stunned faces around him, Kang clenched his fists not in rage, but in responsibility. He made it clear that Trinette would never claim Earth as long as he was still breathing. It turned out the goddess had been right all along. The immortal necromancer was meant to become humanity's savior. Merdi promised to do everything in her power to help him and swore she would always stay by his side. After the brutal clash with the demon, Kang focused on grinding in 6th-ranked dungeons. Day and night he defended those zones, and on rare free days, he made sure to forge alliances across the globe. The Titan and Adral guilds agreed to form a pact and gather the most fearless warriors to protect the planet. Lately, the entire world was in turmoil, facing a dilemma that split humanity into two camps. Some believed mining monocrystals only sped up Earth's destruction, while others argued survival was impossible without it. Everyone wanted profit, but nobody was eager to pay with their own life. Taking all this into account, humanity desperately needed a unified defense system, and thus the World Awakened Association was born. For a full month, Kang untangled these problems until he finally decided to return home. He said his goodbyes to his allies and told Merdi to wait for him on Alphen. While South Korea joyfully welcomed its hero, the saint went to speak with the goddess. At that very moment, the goddess delivered a revelation written in an ancient language. The message was clear: follow the immortal necromancer and never leave him alone. Returning to his native soul, Kang immediately felt a powerful surge of strength and energy. He was supposed to attend a dinner with the president to discuss the threats looming over the country. At the last second, the necromancer said he wasn't hungry and asked to be dropped off right on the street. He had no desire to see the president and dumped all negotiations onto Mr. Chan's shoulders. Ignoring the government was dangerous, since sooner or later it always comes back to bite. But the immortal seemed deaf to his friend's arguments, letting every word pass straight through. He left Mr. Chan alone to clean up the chaos, without a shred of regret. If Chan had known what he was signing up for, he would have never traded the Hammer Guild for this nightmare. Meanwhile, the main hero caught a taxi and headed home, dreaming of finally seeing his family. Then it turned out he'd forgotten his wallet and couldn't pay for the ride. Classic GTA moment, loot lost again. He had to rely on an ancient method of acquiring money, one familiar even to Neanderthals. All it took was calling Jamon, who was always ready to lend a couple of bills. The honor student had no idea how that call would end. He expected a friendly chat, but instead got hit with a brutal request for cash. It seemed the immortal necromancer would never change. Even at the top of Forbes, he'd still be broke. Nuna sensed something was off immediately, because her brother never came home without a serious reason. The moment she heard her classmate had returned from overseas, her face lit up brighter than any star. Without overthinking it, they set up a meeting and spent the next few hours tucked away in a cozy local cafe. The conversation flowed easily, especially after their last encounter, when she'd misunderstood a lot of things. Now they remembered that moment with a smile, even if Nuna still felt a faint trace of awkwardness now and then. By the way, she'd quit her old job and fully committed herself to creating comics. Strangely enough, the main character of her story looks suspiciously similar to Kang, just as cocky, just as reckless, just as fearless, especially when the fights kicked off. Even the hairstyle matched, though Nuna insisted it was nothing more than a coincidence. What mattered most was that she genuinely loved what she was doing and felt she was steadily moving toward her goal. She also made sure to thank him for the magical ointment that completely erased the scars on her head. Now she could live a full life and, of course, secretly hope that one day she might become the immortal's wife. After that warm meeting, it was time to return to office routines and work-related chaos. A lot had changed inside the Adral Guild since the headquarters urgently needed expansion. People lined up eagerly for jobs the moment they heard the guild belonged to Korea's strongest hunter. Recently, Lieutenant Chahai had joined as well, resigning from military service in search of a new challenge. Her level was painfully low for now, but the immortal knew exactly how to fix that. First, he decided to talk things through calmly and analyze her stats in detail. At level 14, she had the Tamer class, boosted loyalty, and principles set in concrete. People like that were priceless in a team. You could rely on them even when everything went to hell. No matter how far military tech advanced, awakened abilities still outweighed everything else. He offered her several enhancement stones to unlock her hidden potential. Her endurance jumped immediately, followed by magical output and physical strength. All that remained was finding the right skill book to begin her real growth arc. Alongside a telepathy book, the boss pulled out an entire stack of manuals on martial arts and beast taming. Studying that library would take months, maybe even years, but the payoff would be massive. The conversation was cut short when an enraged Sangu burst into the room without knocking. He warned that the boss should take some valerian, calm down, and only then turn on the TV. Right now, every Korean news channel was broadcasting the same breaking story. According to reporters, South Korea had signed a defense contract with the Adral Guild. The signature on the document was supposedly placed by the guild's vice president himself. Kang had never authorized anything like that and had no clue where this was headed. It turned out the guild was now obligated to work directly for the nation's defense industry. In plain terms, they were expected to act like soldiers and forget about freedom real fast. Looks like Mr. Chan had seriously screwed up, his first truly massive mistake. It was hard to believe he'd slipped like this, unless someone had slipped him an eclipse-grade powder in his tea. The boss got dressed quickly and made it clear he had no time to deal with this right now. He was heading into a dungeon and taking not only Sangu, but Chaye as well. A bit later, negotiations with the government finally wrapped up. Mr. Chan felt satisfied with the outcome and planned to head to the office to discuss everything with the boss. He had no idea those closed-door talks had already turned into a nationwide talk show. Checking the internet, he saw all of Korea debating the alliance between the guild and the Ministry of Defense. Chan immediately called his assistant to find out what the hell had happened. The response was a counter-question, since Chan himself had formally conducted those insane negotiations. Now it was time to explain how things were actually supposed to go. Mr. Chan had only come to discuss details and draft a preliminary agreement, not to sign anything. The final signature was meant to happen only after personal approval from the immortal necromancer. The government decided to play dirty and frame the situation in the most favorable light for themselves. Cameras were deliberately turned on, pushing the talks into a live broadcast to leave Adral with no escape route. Chan never realized that all those smiling faces at the table had been planning this behind his back for a long time. Their goal was simple: use public opinion to force the guild into signing the contract. Those people had no idea who they'd really gotten involved with, or what kind of consequences were about to fall straight on their heads. A handshake meant nothing, especially once the immortal learned what had been done behind his back. Mr. Chan rushed to meet the boss in person, ready to report everything that had happened. By then, Kang had already left the office and was deep inside a 6-star dungeon at the 9th subway station. For probably the first time in her life, Chaye felt real sticky fear crawl up her spine. Before, there had always been military hardware and soldiers she could rely on without hesitation. Now her entire backup was a guy who'd been in school not that long ago and had barely learned how to defend himself. Sangu tried to calm his partner down, reminding her that today they were just the support squad. Their mission was simple: carve up monster corpses and extract mana crystals for black market sale. All the real work would be done by the necromancer, who had decided to stretch his legs after coming back home. Chayi slowly began to sink into the real world of dungeons and monster combat. Until now, she'd always stood on the other side of the barricades and had no clue how things really worked. Honestly, she didn't like it much. The job felt dirtier, harder, and scarier than she'd imagined. Against her hesitation, Sangu looked 10 times faster and more confident, like he was born for this grind. When crystal harvesting wrapped up, strange and unsettling sounds echoed from a dark corridor. Flickering eyes scared the hell out of her, and she almost called the cops. Panic level, straight out of an It Clown encounter. She needed to calm down. It was just skeletons returning from a mission, dragging monster corpses with them. There wasn't a single scratch on the immortal's face, proof of a flawless clear. He'd long mastered summoning hundreds of undead and was steadily closing in on his former peak. With the dungeon cleared, it was time to train the kids a little. Sangu needed to step up to the next level, and Chaya might just awaken her Tamir talent today. Kang had prepared a trial for her in advance, wanting to see what she was really made of. The girl stepped forward on shaky legs, then screamed like she'd just seen Lady Gaga without makeup. Standing before her was a massive level 57 saber-toothed tiger that she was supposed to control. Chahye had no idea how to do that, even though the system recognized her as a Tamir. No one had ever taught her this, and the best she'd managed before was taming a tiny kitten. The boss told Sangu to make sure the monster didn't make any unnecessary moves. Young and reckless, the guy was ready for anything just to show the boss how far he'd come. He jumped straight into the tiger's cage and made it roar as loud as Elon Musk when someone won't let him go to Mars. The kitty clearly wasn't in a playful mood, forcing Sangu to play Matador. The monster didn't appreciate the joke, flashing fangs and claws before leaping forward to make lunch. The young hunter was ready and instantly activated his new technique: steal flesh. After that, he beat the monster like a stuffed toy, Zero guilt involved. They said Sangu was only mid-rank, but in practice he'd already blown past expectations. The saber-toothed tiger couldn't compete and went down fast. After that, Chaye tried taming a truly dangerous beast for the first time in her life. The strategy was simple. Whenever the monster started growling, Sangu stepped in. His methods were questionable, so kids should probably look away and never try this at home. It was obvious the girl lacked enough mana for proper taming. Without hesitation, the necromancer shared his own energy and made it clear there were no more excuses. There were only two main ways to tame any monster. Either beat it half to death or make it think you're its best friend. If the beating doesn't work, the second option always remains. Chai would have to bond with the saber-toothed tiger, no matter how weird that sounded. For this, the boss devised a simple but effective plan, once again using Sangu. The guy pretended to attack the monster, constantly trying to intimidate it. His job was to be as aggressive as possible and show he wouldn't back down. Shai, on the other hand, tried to protect the tiger, shielding it with her own body. She clenched all her strength into a single strike, pouring every ounce of emotion into it. Even though it was supposed to be an act, the blow came out so strong she nearly killed Sangu. The top-tier acting performance actually won the tiger over, and it almost instantly warmed up to its new master. From that moment on, it was ready to obey any command, which is exactly what true taming looks like. It became obvious that with the right approach, absolutely any monster could be brought under control and turned into a weapon. Everyone nailed the task, though Sangu would definitely need to check his ribs later. They felt like they'd shattered into dust. After training wrapped up, the group lit a campfire and simply soaked in the silence and raw atmosphere of dungeon wilderness. The young, ambitious guy seized the moment to finally say what he'd been bottling up for a long time. It seriously bothered him that he was still stuck as a mid-rank hunter. He wanted more, and was ready to grind for it just as hard as he had during the darkest days. The boss had always been willing to help his friends grow, which was why he'd saved one especially interesting book. With that ancient knowledge, fire magic could break into a whole new tier and turn Sangu into the greatest mage in history. He was currently level 61, but mastering this technique could push him all the way to the top rank. Given that chance, the guy yelled in pure joy, fully aware that the hardest part was still ahead. Once everything was done, the team headed back to the guild office, where crowds of reporters were already waiting. Mr. Chan looked deeply lost in thought, replaying over and over what exactly he should say to the boss. When the furious necromancer entered the office, everyone instantly stepped aside. Mr. Chan forgot his entire prepared speech and suddenly looked like a kid waiting for punishment. After pulling himself together, he explained that none of it was his fault and that the government had used him like a puppet. He laid out every detail and made it clear the Ministry of Defense had exploited a live broadcast for their own agenda. From that moment on, the immortal stopped doubting his deputy and finally saw the full picture. His rage burned so hot that he vowed not just to retaliate, but to show the entire world that even governments didn't scare him. Presidents and ministers no longer seemed untouchable, because a new era was beginning. The era of adventurers. The necromancer ordered an immediate press conference and told them to invite absolutely everyone. Journalists from all over the world swarmed him, desperate to hear the line that would become tomorrow's headline. Mr. Chan had prepared a careful script with polished explanations for the boss. Kang glanced at those prepared answers and simply tore the paper apart, choosing pure improvisation. It was a total fiasco because everyone instantly knew a real show was about to start. The immortal necromancer declared that no agreement would ever be signed without his personal approval. He accused politicians of fraud and made it clear he would never be a pawn in a presidential game. If they crossed him again, he'd pack his bags and leave the country to fend for itself. Everyone understood perfectly well that Korea couldn't afford to lose its strongest hunter. With that, the press conference was cut off immediately. It was obvious a war with public opinion was coming, and Mr. Chan would once again be the one cleaning up the mess. After the conference, journalists and the internet completely lost their minds. The necromancer's words poured gasoline on the fire, keeping people talking day and night. Only the Adral Guild ignored the noise and kept preparing for the disaster ahead. To scale up, they began recruiting new Awakened, who literally lined up to apply. Everyone wanted to work beside the legendary warrior, and over 1,000 applications came in within a single day. Each candidate had to be thoroughly vetted. No room for cowards who'd run at the sight of a demon army. The staff believed that under the necromancer's command, even the weakest rookies could grow like Sangu and Chaye had. While paperwork piled up, the system congratulated the main character on reaching level 70. At last, he could use the very skill that had once made him famous in another world. A single command was enough to send a multi-thousand undead army charging into battle. It was also time to finally use the soul crystal that had been gathering dust in his pocket. Keeping an experienced assassin sealed away without letting him affect battles would be a waste. Restoring his body and bending him to one's own purposes was far more efficient. The moment the terrorist's soul returned to the physical world, he tried to kill his enemy. Only at the last second did he stop, not yet realizing the system wouldn't allow him to harm his master. One command was enough to drop him to his knees, shaking in terror. Now he had two choices: vanish forever in the world of the dead, or serve the necromancer. Deep down, hatred boiled inside him, but he didn't want to be erased and forgotten forever. Killing had always been his favorite thing, so he accepted every condition of his new boss without hesitation. Now the fearless assassin became part of the undead army and was headed straight into war against the demons of Alphen. Even so, he didn't rush to obey every single order, quietly testing how far he could push the limits. Al-Assad was far too arrogant and wild to instantly turn into a loyal lapdog. He just needed time, like people who couldn't process the premiere of the magnificent Marty. To make the rules painfully clear, Kang summoned another familiar known as Kiba. The massive brute grabbed the assassin in an instant and slammed his head into the cold ground. No speeches required. Al-Assad understood everything immediately. Authority here was enforced through raw power. Incidentally, this was Kang's first reunion with Kiba after many years, a general who once commanded the undead armies and delivered victory after victory. The team kept growing, and with it, the necromancer edged closer to an all-out war. For that future, he needed Death Knights, beings capable of commanding entire armies on their own. Under their leadership, skeletons could fight freely even when Kang was worlds away. A full month passed after the battle with Rushmode, and little Bibi finally returned from the realm of the dead. She was clearly unhappy that the boss hadn't saved her sooner, forcing her to spend weeks hanging out with Hitler and Napoleon. Slowly, her energy came back, the anger faded, and she prepared to get back to work. Sangu was also making impressive progress, absorbing fire magic skills and steadily moving forward. He no longer looked like a weakling and could already be trusted with genuinely dangerous missions. Not long ago, he'd met his beloved cat, which he constantly carried in his arms. Sangu had no idea she could actually transform into a devilish bat-like child. Kang had no time for nonsense like that. He needed facts, real skills, and raw emotion. The young mage immediately demonstrated what he'd learned over the past few days of brutal training. His fire orbs had become noticeably deadlier, and this was only the beginning. Chaye was also making major strides, steadily developing her Tamir skill. So far, she'd tamed only one large monster, but even that was enough to double her level. Now it was the rest of the team's turn. Everyone had to be ready for the coming war. After returning to the real world, several urgent problems still needed to be handled fast. The terrorists behind the American attack had been identified, and it was time to erase them from existence. To do that, coordination with the Titan Guild was required for a joint operation. Mr. Dean was glad to hear from an old acquaintance and agreed to help without hesitation. By then, the American Guild had already picked up the terrorist trail on its own. Kang made it clear the time for revenge had come, and he intended to bathe in enemy blood. Someone leaked those words to the media, and by evening every TV channel was buzzing. People wanted to know if the necromancer would really go all the way and wipe out a terrorist organization. Watching all of this closely was the man responsible for setting the entire chain of events in motion. Using connections and classified documents, Layson extracted terrorist contacts from an influential businessman. He spent nearly all his money to put a hit on the necromancer. The plan collapsed, the guild teetered on bankruptcy, and top hunters began defecting to rivals. For the boss, it was a tragedy he might never fully recover from. Drowning in rage and hatred, he felt himself sinking into darkness when he suddenly sensed a presence. A misty aura appeared from nowhere and quietly asked what Layson truly desired. Though confused, the hunter answered honestly. Only bloody revenge mattered to him. The apparition laughed and promised to lend him power to achieve that goal. It invited him to a meeting and vanished just as suddenly. The room returned to normal, making it hard to tell reality from illusion. Looking around, Layson noticed a mysterious sword shimmering with a strange aura. The blade had once belonged to his beloved sister, proving the apparition was real. If it could truly help him get revenge, there was no reason not to take the chance. Far from his home, staring out at the Manhattan night, Mr. Dean reflected on his last conversation with the necromancer. The Adral Guild had asked him for only two things. First, to arrange transport to Central Asia, and then to stabilize the region after the terrorists were eliminated. From the outside, everything looked stupidly simple, especially for a guild with a budget that might as well have been bottomless. At this point, the Titan Guild only had to follow the Immortals' instructions and keep the questions to a minimum. If the operation failed, a tidal wave of public backlash would hit them, and surviving that would be brutal. But if it succeeded, they would be hailed as the heroes who crushed international terrorism. Out of nowhere, Sam Merdi arrived at the meeting, finally ready to unload everything weighing on her heart. She openly declared that she had to leave the guild and follow the necromancer, becoming his support and shield. This was the goddess's will, and Merdi couldn't change it, no matter how badly she wanted to. Dean was genuinely thrown off since his guild's recent surge in popularity had been driven almost entirely by her presence. Her blessings and prophetic skills had been printing value non-stop, and now that era seemed to be ending. On top of that, the fate of the Paladin Order, created to serve the heavens, was still unresolved. Trying to stop Merdi would have been pointless. She clearly knew better than anyone how to prevent the coming disaster. As a farewell gift, Mr. Dean offered her the Paladin Order itself, believing it might still prove useful. They talked warmly and parted like old comrades who had survived more than one nightmare together. Yet while Merdi made her way toward Korea, something truly horrific could already be unfolding here. Driven by pure revenge, Layson left his home, fully committing to claiming the power of the abyss. Following strange instructions, he eventually came face to face with a statue of his greatest enemy. That man was called a savior, a title Layson completely rejected. He smashed the statue in full view of a guard who had stepped away for a bathroom break. The guard tried to intervene and instantly felt his body lift off the ground. An unknown force locked his movements, and glowing red eyes marked the beginning of the end. No matter how loudly he screamed, help was never coming, and with every second, Layson grew stronger. A second guard rushed in, but by then it was already too late. His radio sparked and died before it could even reach the police. Now both guards were hanging in midair, like a Hogwarts lesson gone wrong, powered not by magic, but raw terror. Convulsions and internal bleeding shattered their sanity in moments. The slaughter ended almost instantly, and two grown men stopped breathing. To someone like Layson, They were nothing more than disposable trash. With his hands barely stained, he descended to the nearest subway station where a dungeon waited. Until now, he hadn't fully understood what was happening, but at last his mind cleared. He looked around, trying to grasp how he had ended up in such a savage, terrifying place. The memories snapped into focus. An unseen monster had been guiding him the entire time. Calling the police was pointless now, and surrendering to the flow of borrowed power felt like the smarter gamble. A portal opened before him, and an unseen voice relentlessly pushed him forward. He felt he had nothing left, and turning away from vengeance would have been pure stupidity. On the other side of the portal, he beheld an icy palace, its path anything but easy. Unnatural cold locked his body in place, yet that was far from the only anomaly. The monsters along the way ignored him completely, as if some unseen aura shielded the intruder. Reaching the frozen palace, he saw not a single guard. The moment he entered the main hall, he felt the presence of a truly overwhelming being. The master of this place sat calmly upon the throne. A merciless grin made it clear. This monster was the ghost that had lured him here. All that remained was to meet the creature capable of dragging an entire world to its death.